My name is Roland Jefferson. I am 65 years old, a retired city transit bus driver living in the quiet suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia. I thought driving the night shift in downtown Atlanta was the most dangerous job a man could have. I spent 35 years gripping a massive steering wheel, dealing with the chaos of the city streets, the unpredictable crowds, and the endless traffic, just so my family would never have to know what struggling felt like. But if you are watching this today, I need you to take a deep breath and listen closely. Because the most ruthless predators I ever faced were not out there in the dark city alleys. No. They were sitting right at my dinner table, eating the food I paid for, smiling in my face while they plotted to lock me away and steal my life. What I am about to tell you will make you question how well you truly know the people sleeping under your own roof. For decades, I took pride in being the provider. When I met Brenda 30 years ago, she was a hard-working single mother, doing her best to raise her 7-year-old boy, Trey. I fell in love with her grace, her spirit, and her dedication. I stepped into that boy's life and claimed him as my own. I firmly believe that any man can help make a child, but it takes a real man with a steady heart to step up and raise one. I taught Trey how to throw a baseball, how to tie a necktie, and how to treat people with respect. Let me tell you what it means to be a city transit driver. It means waking up at 3 a.m. when the world is pitch black and freezing cold just to warm up a 40-foot machine. It means your lower back aching constantly from the vibrations of the road. It means dealing with angry passengers, dodging reckless drivers, and keeping a smile on your face because you know every hour of overtime puts food on your family's table. I gave my youth and my health to that job. I wore my uniform with absolute pride. When my knees started to give out in my late 50s, I did not complain. I just took some aspirin and kept climbing those bus steps. I did it all for Brenda and Trey. They were my universe. I wanted to be the shield that protected them from the harshness of the world. All those years of back-breaking work paid off. I managed to buy a beautiful 5-bedroom brick home in a peaceful neighborhood. It had a wraparound porch, a huge backyard, and hardwood floors that I polished myself every Sunday. It was my sanctuary. It was the physical proof that a black man from humble beginnings could build a kingdom for his family. I trusted Brenda with every fiber of my being. She managed the household finances, she kept our lives organized, and she was my partner in everything. I thought we were walking hand in hand into a peaceful retirement. Then Trey met Chloe. When Trey was growing up, he was a good boy. Respectful, hard-working. But love can make a man blind, and it certainly blinded my son when he met Chloe. She was a white woman from a wealthy background up north, but she had been cut off by her family for reasons she never wanted to discuss. She had champagne taste on a tap water budget. From the moment Trey brought her home, I could see the dollar signs flashing in her eyes. She wore designer clothes, drove a leased luxury car she absolutely could not afford, and constantly demanded the finer things in life. I remember the day of their wedding. It was a lavish affair at a country club, far beyond what Trey could afford. I ended up draining a significant portion of my hard-earned savings just to cover the catering because Chloe's parents refused to contribute a single dime. They looked down on Trey. They looked down on me. But I swallowed my pride and signed the checks because seeing my boy happy was all that mattered. I thought Chloe would eventually settle down and appreciate the value of $1. Instead, her appetite for luxury only grew. She needed the newest smartphone, the weekend spa trips, the organic meal deliveries. Trey, wanting to be the perfect husband, was drowning in credit card debt, just trying to keep up with her extravagant lifestyle. I watched my son losing sleep, his face lined with stress, working himself to the bone to buy her affection. Brenda came to me one evening with tears in her eyes. She played on my deepest vulnerability, my desire to be the ultimate protector. She sat on the edge of our bed holding my hands and told me that Trey was on the verge of a breakdown. She said, "Roland, you have always been our rock. It is our duty as parents to help the kids get on their feet. If we move into the guest house, Trey won't have to pay rent. He can catch his breath. We don't need all these empty bedrooms anyway." It sounded so noble. So out of love, I agreed to it. I packed up the life I had built. I moved my favorite recliner, my old record player, and my quiet life into the small 2-bedroom renovated guest house in the backyard. I handed over the keys to the kingdom I had bled for. I watched from the window as Chloe directed movers carrying in brand new, incredibly expensive furniture into my home. But I smiled, because a father's sacrifice is supposed to be silent. I kept paying the property taxes and the main mortgage. I thought I was doing the righteous thing. I thought I was securing my family's future. I had no idea I was digging my own grave. The nightmare began about 6 months ago. It did not happen all at once. It crept up on me slowly like a dark storm cloud rolling over the horizon. I started experiencing sudden, terrifying memory lapses. One morning I woke up and could not remember where I had placed my wallet. The next day I found my car keys inside the refrigerator. I would walk into the kitchen to pour a glass of water and stand there for 10 minutes, staring blankly at the sink, completely forgetting why I was in the room. But it was not just the forgetfulness. It was a deep, bone-crushing fatigue that made my arms and legs feel like they were filled with wet sand. It is hard to describe the absolute horror of losing your own mind. It is not just forgetting where your keys are. It is standing in the middle of the grocery store aisle staring at a can of soup and suddenly feeling like you do not know how you got there or how to get back home. The panic rises in your chest like a tidal wave. My hands would shake so badly I could barely hold a spoon. My heart would palpitate wildly. I would sleep for 12 hours and wake up feeling like I had been beaten with a baseball bat. I felt like a stranger trapped inside a failing body. I would sit in my chair and the room would start to spin. My vision would blur and a heavy, suffocating fog would settle over my brain. I felt like I was wading through deep water just to form a simple thought. I have always been a sharp, alert man. I had to be, driving a massive bus through city traffic. But suddenly, I felt like my mind was dissolving. I was terrified. I sat at the kitchen table one morning, my hands trembling as I held my coffee mug. I looked at Brenda and told her I needed to see a doctor. I told her something was terribly wrong with my head. But instead of showing genuine concern, Brenda just sighed. She walked over, patted my shoulder with a look of extreme pity, and said, "Roland, honey, you are just getting older. Your memory is slipping. It happens to everyone your age. You are just confused again." Confused. That word became her favorite weapon. Chloe was even worse. Whenever she came over to the guest house, she would treat me like a toddler. If I repeated a question, she would roll her eyes, look at Trey, and say in a loud, condescending voice, "He is having another one of his episodes, Trey. We need to be patient with him. His mind is just gone." They aggressively started planting the idea that I was suffering from early onset dementia. They used that word constantly. Dementia. They tossed it around the house like a death sentence. Every time I dropped a fork, every time I paused to remember a name, they would exchange knowing glances and shake their heads. They convinced Trey that I was rapidly deteriorating. And the most terrifying part was that because of the thick fog in my head, I actually started to believe them. When you cannot trust your own brain, you become entirely dependent on the people around you. And they knew exactly how to use my fear against me. Once they established the narrative that I was losing my mind, the takeover began. It was swift and brutal. Brenda sat me down one afternoon with a stack of bank statements. She used a soft, soothing voice that made my skin crawl. She told me that I had been making mistakes with the bills. She claimed I was paying the same utility bill twice and forgetting to pay others. She told me I was becoming a financial liability to myself. Before I could even protest, she took my debit cards. She took my checkbook. She told me she was going to manage all the accounts from now on to protect our savings. When I tried to argue, my mind felt so slow, so sluggish, that the words just would not form properly. Chloe chimed in, telling me I was being stubborn and irrational, which she claimed was a classic symptom of dementia. I felt completely powerless. I watched my wife put my entire financial life into her purse, and I was too dizzy and confused to stop her. Next, they took control of my communication. Chloe started intercepting all the mail. She told the postal worker to forward everything to the main house because I was supposedly throwing away important documents by accident. I never saw a bank statement or a medical bill again. I was completely cut off from my own life. She made sure I felt completely incompetent. One afternoon, I tried to walk to the local barber shop just to get out of the house. Chloe saw me from the main house window, ran out into the yard, and physically grabbed my arm. She yelled, "Roland, what are you doing? You know you wander off and get lost. You are going to get hit by a car." She dragged me back into the guest house like I was a disobedient dog. I felt my dignity crumbling to dust. I was a man who used to navigate a 12-ton bus through pouring rain and gridlocked traffic, and now my own daughter-in-law was treating me like an invalid who could not walk to the corner of the street. They stripped me of my agency piece by piece. After taking my credit cards and intercepting my mail, Brenda took my car keys. She said my reaction times were too slow, that I was a danger to society. I looked out the window of the guest house and watched Trey drive my pristine vintage pickup truck to work. My truck. The one I had restored with my own 2 hands. Then they isolated me from my friends. I used to go fishing every other Saturday with my old buddies from the transit union. We would sit by the lake, drink cold beer, and talk about the old days. But suddenly, my friends stopped coming around. One day, during a rare moment of clarity, I managed to find my cell phone and called my best friend. I asked him why he had not been by the house. He sounded extremely uncomfortable. He told me that Brenda had called him and the other guys. She had told them that my dementia was getting severe, that I was prone to violent outbursts, and that seeing people from my past was causing me too much distress. She had specifically asked them to stay away for my own good. I dropped the phone on the floor and wept. I was a proud, hard-working man who had never hurt a soul. I had spent my entire life providing a safe haven for my family, and now I was a prisoner in my own backyard. My world shrank to the 4 walls of that guest house. The only human interaction I had was when Brenda came in to bring me my meals and my daily cup of dark roast coffee. I would sit in my recliner, staring at the walls, wondering how much longer I had until the darkness took over completely. I prayed to God to just take me quickly rather than let me fade away into a babbling, empty shell of a man. I felt so much guilt for becoming a burden to the woman I loved. I wept tears of shame, believing I was ruining Brenda's golden years. But the truth was far more sinister than any disease. The universe was about to pull the blindfold from my eyes. I was not a sick man. I was a target. And the terrifying reality of my condition was not hidden in my brain chemistry. It was hiding right there on the kitchen counter. I remember the exact afternoon the fog in my head started to feel less like a sickness and more like a trap. I have always been a man of strict routine. When you drive a city bus for over 3 decades, your internal clock gets wired to transit schedules, routes, and precise timing. That same discipline applied to my personal finances. Every third Tuesday of the month, the physical statement for my primary retirement savings account arrived in the mail. It had arrived on that exact schedule for 15 years without fail. I used to sit at the kitchen table, put on my reading glasses, and review every single line to make sure the nest egg I bled for was secure. But that Tuesday, when I shuffled out to the mailbox at the end of the driveway, my legs feeling like they were made of solid lead, the envelope was completely missing. I flipped through the utility bills and the junk flyers 3 times. Nothing. My heart did a strange flutter in my chest. I knew it should be there. I could feel it in my gut. I walked back into the guest house and found Brenda wiping down the kitchen counter. I held up the stack of mail and asked her if the retirement statement had come early or if she had seen it anywhere. I will never forget the look she gave me. It was a look you would give a lost, pitiful child. She dried her hands on a dish towel, walked over to me, and placed her warm palm over my trembling hand. She sighed. It was a long, exaggerated sound of exhaustion and sorrow. "Oh, Roland," she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "You forgot again. You told me to shred it yesterday. You said the numbers were giving you a terrible headache and you did not want to look at them anymore." I stood there frozen. My mind raced, trying to pierce through the thick gray sludge that had been clouding my brain for weeks. I had absolutely no memory of saying that. None. A man does not work 35 years in the freezing dawn and sweltering afternoon heat just to shred the proof of his life labor because it gave him a headache. I tried to argue. I told her that made no sense. I told her I wanted to see the shredded pieces in the bin. Right at that moment, the front door opened and Trey and Chloe walked in from the main house. They did not even miss a beat. Trey looked at his mother, then looked at me with this heavy theatrical disappointment. "Come on, Pops," Trey said, shaking his head slowly. "I was standing right here when you handed it to Mom. You were getting all agitated. You told her to get rid of it." Chloe chimed in right on cue, crossing her arms and letting out a sharp, impatient breath. "Honestly, Roland, you are scaring us," she said loudly. "You do not remember anything anymore. You are getting worse every single day. We are just trying to help you, and you are treating Brenda like a criminal." I looked at the 3 of them. My wife, my stepson, my daughter-in-law. They stood united, a solid wall of absolute certainty. The psychological weight of 3 people looking you in the eye and telling you your reality is a lie is entirely crushing. I retreated to my recliner, feeling completely defeated. I sat in the dim light of the guest house living room, burying my face in my hands. I wept quietly. I truly believed my brain was rotting away. I believed I was becoming a burden, a crazy old man who yelled at his devoted family over things that never happened. I felt so much shame. I prayed to the Lord to either restore my mind or take me home, because living as a ghost in my own body was a torture I could no longer bear. But the Lord works in mysterious ways, and sometimes salvation comes not from a miracle from the sky, but from a careless mistake made by arrogant people. A few days later, the oppressive fatigue hitting me harder than ever, I woke up incredibly early. It was barely 5 in the morning. Brenda was still fast asleep in the bedroom. I dragged myself out of bed, my joints aching, my head swimming in that familiar, heavy confusion. I walked into the kitchen. The coffee pot was not on yet. Brenda always insisted on making my coffee, bringing it to me right as I woke up, claiming it was her special way of taking care of her sick husband. But that morning my stomach was churning. I felt violently ill. I grabbed a glass of tap water instead, went out to the back patio, and threw up in the bushes. I sat on the patio chair, shivering in the cool morning air, sipping the plain water. Hours passed. Brenda finally woke up panicked when she did not find me in bed and rushed out with my steaming mug of dark roast coffee. I told her my stomach was upset and I could not drink it. She pushed it toward me, insisting I needed my morning routine, her eyes flashing with a strange, hard urgency. But I refused. I poured the coffee into the grass. She glared at me, her mask slipping for just a fraction of a second before turning on her heel and marching back inside. By the late afternoon, something miraculous happened. The fog in my head began to thin. The heavy, suffocating pressure behind my eyes lifted slightly. My thoughts, which had been moving like thick molasses for months, suddenly had a spark of their old speed. My legs felt lighter. I still felt weak, but the profound, terrifying confusion was gone. I sat up in my chair, looking at my hands. They were not shaking anymore. Later that evening, Trey and Chloe went out to a fancy dinner downtown, and Brenda drove to the supermarket to buy groceries. I was completely alone on the property. My mind was clearer than it had been in half a year. A terrible, gnawing instinct began to take root in my gut. If my dementia was a progressive, incurable disease, why did I suddenly feel so lucid after skipping Brenda coffee? I needed answers. I walked out of the guest house and made my way across the lawn to the main house, the home I had built and paid for. I let myself in, using the spare key I kept hidden in the garage. I walked through the pristine rooms, looking at the expensive furniture Chloe had bought with Trey credit cards. I went into the kitchen. I did not know exactly what I was looking for, but the lie about the shredded bank statement was still burning in my mind. I opened the pantry cabinet where they kept the trash can, thinking maybe I could find the shredded paper and piece it together just to prove to myself that I was not crazy. I pulled out the trash bag. I sifted through the discarded food wrappers, empty wine bottles, and junk mail. There was no shredded bank statement. But as I dug deeper near the very bottom of the bag, my fingers brushed against a crumpled, sticky piece of paper. It was a pharmacy receipt. I pulled it out and smoothed the receipt on the granite countertop. The bright overhead kitchen lights illuminated the black ink. It was from a pharmacy 2 towns over, not the local one we had used for decades. The name on the prescription was not mine. It was not Brenda. It was not Trey. It was in the name of Chloe Mother, a woman who lived halfway across the country and had never visited us. I looked at the medication name printed on the receipt. It was a long, complex chemical name I had never seen before. Next to it, the dosage was unusually high. I pulled out my cell phone, my hands steady and purposeful now, and typed the name of the drug into the search bar. The search results loaded, and as I read the medical descriptions, the blood completely drained from my face. My breathing stopped. It was a heavy industrial-grade sedative, a powerful antipsychotic medication typically used in strict clinical settings for patients with severe, violent psychiatric conditions. The medical articles warned in bold letters about the extreme side effects, especially in older adults. Severe memory loss, profound confusion, extreme fatigue, loss of motor skills, disorientation. The warnings explicitly stated that administering this drug to a healthy senior citizen would rapidly mimic the exact symptoms of advanced aggressive dementia. I stood in the center of the kitchen of the house I had broken my back to buy, holding that crumpled receipt. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with a sickening, violent force: the missing bank statements, the sudden isolation from my friends, the constant, repetitive gaslighting about my memory, the intense, demanding insistence that I drink that specific cup of dark roast coffee Brenda prepared for me every single morning. The coffee, with its strong, bitter taste, perfectly masking the flavor of crushed chemical poison. I was not sick. I was not losing my mind. My brain was not failing me. My wife, the woman I had loved and provided for over 30 years. My stepson, the boy I had raised, clothed, and educated, my daughter-in-law, whom I had welcomed into my home. They were slowly, systematically, and deliberately poisoning me. They were dosing me every single day, turning me into a helpless, drooling invalid. They were destroying my brain chemistry to create a fake medical history. They needed everyone, including myself, to believe I was incompetent. And the most terrifying part was that they were doing it right to my face, smiling at me, calling me honey and pops, while they slipped a chemical straitjacket into my morning routine. I dropped the receipt onto the counter. A massive wave of nausea hit me, but it was not from the drug. It was from the sheer, unfathomable evil of what I had just uncovered. I had spent 35 years watching my back on the dark transit routes of Atlanta, looking out for muggers, thieves, and dangerous individuals. I had locked my doors at night to keep the monsters out. I never realized I had invited the monsters into my living room, fed them, and gave them the keys to my kingdom. The fear completely vanished. The shame I had felt for months, the tears I had cried thinking I was becoming a burden to my family. All of it evaporated into thin air. In its place, a massive, unyielding inferno of rage ignited in the deepest part of my soul. It was a cold, calculated fury. The kind of anger that a man feels when he realizes his entire life, his legacy, and his very mind are being stolen by the people he trusted most. I folded the pharmacy receipt carefully and slid it deep into my pocket. I wiped the counter clean, making sure I left absolutely no trace of my presence. I walked out of the main house and locked the door behind me, stepping out into the cool evening air. I looked back at the large, beautiful brick house. It no longer looked like a sanctuary. It looked like a den of thieves. I walked back to the guest house, sat down in my recliner, and stared at the empty coffee mug on the side table. The conflict had shifted completely. I was no longer a confused, dying old man fighting a losing battle against a deteriorating mind. I was a fully lucid, incredibly angry father who had just uncovered a murder plot in his own backyard. They wanted to play a twisted game with my life. They wanted to steal my dignity and my wealth. But they had made a fatal mistake. They had let me skip my morning coffee. They had let me wake up. And now that my eyes were wide open, I knew exactly what I had to do. They thought I was a helpless old fool, but they were about to find out what happens when you cross a man who has nothing left to lose and everything to protect. I was not going to just defend myself. I was going to utterly destroy them. I knew exactly what had to be done the very next morning. The sun had barely started to peek through the blinds of the guest house, casting long and gray shadows across the wooden floor. My body felt like a massive lead weight. Every joint in my legs ached, protesting the movement as I forced myself to sit up on the edge of the mattress. My heart pounded a slow and heavy rhythm against my ribs. I heard the familiar creak of the kitchen floorboards outside the bedroom. Brenda was awake. She was out there preparing my daily dose of poison. I dragged myself to the small bathroom, splashed freezing cold water on my face, and stared at my reflection in the mirror. My eyes were bloodshot and deeply sunken. I looked like a man standing on the very edge of the grave. But today, I was going to take a firm step back from that ledge. I shuffled out to my recliner just as Brenda walked into the living space. She wore a soft pink robe, her hair neatly tied back, carrying that steaming mug of dark roast coffee. The smell of it, which was once a daily comfort to me, now turned my stomach into a tight, sickening knot. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said. Her voice was incredibly smooth, like warm honey. "Drink up. You need your energy today." I took the mug with trembling hands, forcing a weak and confused smile onto my face. "Thank you, Brenda," I mumbled, playing the part of the broken old man perfectly. She patted my cheek, her eyes completely devoid of any genuine warmth, and turned back to the bedroom to get dressed. The moment her back was turned, I moved faster than I had in 6 months. I hurried to the kitchen sink, turned on the faucet to mask the sound, and poured every last drop of that tainted liquid down the drain. I rinsed the mug quickly, leaving just a few brown streaks at the bottom, and shuffled back to my chair. When she returned, she saw the empty mug on the side table and smiled with a sickening kind of satisfaction. "That is a good boy," she whispered. That phrase echoed in my mind all day long. A good boy. I was a grown man, a proud African-American father who had weathered decades of brutal hardship to provide for his family, and my own wife was treating me like an obedient pet being put to sleep. The next 48 hours were a profound and terrifying revelation. I continued the charade with absolute dedication. I poured the coffee away every single morning, hiding the liquid in a thermos if Brenda stayed in the room too long, disposing of it outside in the dirt later. I chewed the food she brought me, carefully swallowing only when I was entirely sure it tasted clean, or wrapping it in paper napkins to throw out when I was alone. And slowly, miraculously, the heavy curtain covering my brain began to tear apart. By the morning of the third day, I woke up before the alarm clock even went off. The crushing fatigue in my bones was completely gone. The dizziness that used to spin the room whenever I stood up had vanished into thin air. I looked out the window at the morning dew on the grass, and the colors outside seemed incredibly bright and sharp. My thoughts were no longer wading through deep mud. They were quick, precise, and crystal clear. I remembered the names of my transit buddies. I remembered the exact balance of my savings account, down to the penny. I remembered exactly who I was. Roland Jefferson. A man who built his kingdom with his own 2 hands. The physical relief was incredible, but the emotional reality was absolutely agonizing. Feeling my mind fully return meant fully understanding the depth of the betrayal. I sat in the quiet of the guest house, realizing how dangerously close I had come to being entirely erased. They had almost succeeded. If I had not found that pharmacy receipt in Chloe's trash can, I would have kept drinking that coffee until I forgot my own name. I would have let them walk me right into a psychiatric ward, drooling and smiling, thanking them for taking such good care of me. A cold and hard knot of anger settled deep in the center of my chest. I was not going to let them get away with this. I needed undeniable proof. I needed to see exactly what they were doing and saying when they thought the old man was lost in his dementia. I had to be highly strategic. I waited patiently until Trey and Chloe left for work in their expensive cars, and Brenda announced she was going to her weekly book club downtown. She locked the guest house door from the outside, a new and humiliating habit she claimed was for my own safety, so I would not wander off. But a man who has lived on a property for decades knows its secrets. I had a spare key hidden under a loose floorboard in the utility closet. As soon as her car pulled out of the driveway, I retrieved the key, unlocked the door, and slipped out the back. I walked 3 miles to the nearest electronics store. I did not call an Uber or take the public bus. I needed the fresh air, and I needed to move my legs to prove to myself that my physical strength had truly returned. The walk felt like a solitary pilgrimage. When I walked through the sliding glass doors of the tech store, a young clerk approached and asked how he could help me. I told him I needed a security camera. Something tiny, something that connected directly to a cell phone and did not blink or make a sound. The clerk showed me a micro camera no bigger than a postage stamp. It was completely black, equipped with high-definition video and crystal-clear audio recording capabilities. I paid for it in cash from a hidden stash I kept wrapped in an old sock for emergencies. Walking back home, I felt a heavy and terrible weight pressing down on my shoulders. I was about to spy on my own family. I was about to violate the sanctity of my own home, but they had violated my mind, my body, and my trust in the most intimate way possible. The rules of family no longer applied here. They were strangers to me now. Dangerous strangers living in the house I paid for with my sweat and blood. I got back to the guest house, slipped inside, and locked the door behind me just minutes before Brenda returned. I sat in my chair, holding the tiny black camera in the palm of my hand, waiting for the perfect moment to plant the hidden eye. That opportunity came the following afternoon. Brenda told me she was going over to the main house to help Chloe prepare for a lavish dinner party they were hosting for Trey friends from the corporate office. She told me to stay put, watch a movie, and rest my sick brain. I nodded, staring blankly at the television screen as she locked me in. I waited a full hour. I watched through the blinds as Brenda and Chloe left the house to go to the luxury florist down the street. Trey was still at the office. The coast was entirely clear. I grabbed the tiny camera and my phone, unlocked my door, and walked quickly across the backyard. Stepping into the main house felt incredibly surreal. The central air conditioning was humming quietly. The smell of expensive scented candles filled the air. It was my house, the property I held the deed to, but it felt completely alien to me. I walked into the grand living room, a space I had designed specifically for warm family gatherings. Now it was decorated with Chloe modern abstract art and expensive imported rugs. I needed a vantage point that captured the entire room, especially the seating area and the gold bar cart where they liked to mix their drinks in the evenings. I walked over to the tall, dark oak bookshelf in the corner. It was filled with thick, decorative books that Chloe bought purely for show books I knew nobody in that house ever read. I reached up to the third shelf, moving a heavy encyclopedia slightly to the left. I wedged the tiny camera right in the crevice between the book spine and the wood paneling. The lens was virtually invisible, blending perfectly into the dark shadows of the shelf. I quickly synced the device to the application on my phone. The screen flickered to life, showing a crisp, wide-angle view of the living room. The audio picked up the faint hum of the refrigerator all the way in the kitchen. It was flawless. I slipped out of the house, making sure the back door locked securely behind me, and hurried back to my sanctuary in the guest house. My heart was racing, not out of fear of getting caught, but out of pure anticipation. The trap was set. Now, I just had to sit in the dark and wait for the rats to take the bait. I did not have to wait very long. Night fell, painting the suburban sky in deep shades of purple and black. The dinner party at the main house had finally ended. The guests had gone home. I sat in the complete darkness of the guest house living room, the only light coming from the glowing screen of my cell phone resting in my lap. I opened the camera application and held my breath. The live feed loaded instantly. The grand living room was dimly lit by a single designer floor lamp. Trey, Chloe, and Brenda were sitting on the expensive leather sofa. My stepson, the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle and helped with his math homework, was leaning back with his expensive shoes resting right on my mahogany coffee table. Chloe was laughing loudly, tossing her blonde hair over her shoulder. And Brenda, my wife. She was standing by the bar cart pouring drinks into heavy crystal glasses. I watched closely. I recognized the bottle she was holding in her hand. It was my 20-year-old reserve bourbon, an incredibly expensive gift I had received years ago and saved for a truly special occasion. She poured generous amounts into 3 glasses and handed them out. They raised their glasses in a celebratory toast. I turned the volume up all the way on my phone, pressing the speaker close to my ear. "To a very successful evening," Trey said, taking a long sip of my whiskey. His voice was completely relaxed, free of any guilt or worry. Chloe smirked, swirling the amber liquid in her glass. It would be a lot more successful if we did not have to worry about the old man wandering over here ruining the vibe. He looked particularly pathetic today. I swear sometimes I think he is putting on an act just to annoy me and seek attention. Brenda sat down next to Trey and let out a sharp, cruel laugh that sent shivers down my spine. "Oh, he is not putting on an act," Chloe Brenda said. "Believe me, he is fading fast." I watched my wife reach into the pocket of her expensive cardigan. She pulled out a small, amber-colored glass vial. The pharmacy label was completely torn off. She held it up between her fingers, catching the dim light of the floor lamp. "I just got the refill from the doctor," Brenda said, her voice dropping into a wicked conspiratorial whisper. "Keep crushing these into his food. The doctor said a few more weeks of this, and he won't even know his own name." Trey laughed, a genuine hearty laugh from the bottom of his chest. "Just make sure you do not mix up his coffee with mine, Mom. I actually have a career to maintain." Chloe leaned her head on Trey's shoulder, giggling softly. "Once he is completely gone, we can finally get the estate lawyer in here to finalize the paperwork. I am so tired of waiting. I want to start renovating this place without worrying about his name being on the deed." They clinked their glasses together again. The sharp ping of the crystal echoed through the tiny speaker of my phone and into the dead silence of my room. I sat alone in the dark, staring at the glowing screen as the three of them casually discussed the deliberate destruction of my mind and the theft of my life. My heart did not just break in that moment. It shattered into a million jagged, bleeding pieces. The pain in my chest was so intense, so deeply suffocating, that I literally had to grip the armrests of my recliner to keep from falling out of it onto the floor. 30 years of marriage. 30 years of backbreaking sacrifice. I had loved that woman with everything I had. I had treated her son like my own flesh and blood. I had worked until my hands bled and my back gave out to give them a life of supreme comfort and security. And there they were, drinking my expensive whiskey, laughing joyfully about turning me into a drooling, mindless shell of a man. The betrayal was absolute and total. It was a violent violation of every vow, every promise, every single ounce of trust I had ever given them. I felt a cold tear slide down my cheek, hot and stinging against my weathered skin. I did not wipe it away. I let it fall. It was the last tear I would ever shed for Brenda. It was the last ounce of sorrow I would ever give to Trey. As I watched them laugh on the screen, the deep sorrow evaporated. It was instantly replaced by a sensation so profoundly cold and sharp, it felt like a steel blade resting against my spine. They thought they had won the game. They thought Roland Jefferson was a fading memory, a broken old fool who could be easily swept under the rug while they spent his life savings. They had absolutely no idea that their cruel medicine had worn off. They had no idea that the man watching them from the shadows was wide awake, fully coherent, and seething with a quiet, devastating fury. I turned off the phone screen and set it gently on the table. The darkness wrapped around me like a heavy, protective blanket. The old Roland, the loving father, and the devoted, overly trusting husband died in that chair tonight. The man who sat in his place was a survivor, and I was going to make sure that every single one of them paid for what they had done down to the very last bitter drop. I sat paralyzed in the pitch black of the guest house. The initial wave of devastation from realizing my own family was actively poisoning my morning coffee had hollowed out my chest. But as my eyes remained glued to the glowing screen of my cell phone, the raw pain began to curdle into a burning, demanding question. Why? I was a retired transit worker. Yes, I had a solid pension, a decent savings account, and a beautiful brick house paid off in full. But was that enough to drive a woman I had loved for 30 years and a son I had raised from a boy to commit premeditated murder? It did not make sense. Trey and Chloe were fiercely greedy, but they were also incredibly impatient. Stealing my pension month by month would be a slow, tedious process for people who craved instant, flashy luxury. There had to be something else. A much bigger prize. I leaned closer to the small screen, my heart thudding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. On the video feed, Chloe stood up from the leather sofa. She walked over to the large oak dining table, the exact table I had sanded and stained with my own 2 hands, and unrolled a large, thick tube of paper. She spread it out flat, using her empty wine glass to hold down one corner. Trey leaned over her shoulder, his eyes wide with a hungry, predatory gleam. Brenda joined them, adjusting her reading glasses and peering down. I pinched the screen of my phone, zooming in on the image. It was a massive architectural blueprint. My mind raced, filtering through decades of memories until it slammed into a forgotten corner of my past. My grandfather, Elijah Jefferson, had been a sharecropper who moved to Atlanta in the 1940s, seeking a better life. He faced doors slammed in his face and worked 3 grueling, back-breaking jobs, saving every single dime he could hide in a coffee can under his mattress. Before he passed away, he bought a 5-acre plot of commercial land in a forgotten, rundown industrial sector on the outskirts of the city. For decades, that land sat completely empty, overgrown with tall, stubborn weeds surrounded by rusted chain-link fences and cracked concrete. Everyone told me to sell it for scraps. Wealthy real estate agents called it worthless dirt. But I held on to it. I paid the minimal property taxes every single year because it was the only piece of generational wealth my grandfather had managed to secure for our bloodline. It was a permanent symbol of his sweat, his endurance, and his love for our family. I had almost forgotten about its monetary value because, to me, its worth was entirely spiritual. Chloe tapped her perfectly manicured fingernail against the center of the blueprint. Her voice was trembling with pure, unadulterated excitement. She said, "The city council just quietly approved the rezoning permits yesterday. This entire 5-acre block is the exact epicenter of the new development project. A massive tech conglomerate out of California is building a sprawling corporate campus right here. They are buying up the entire grid." Trey let out a low, greedy whistle. He ran his hand over his face, laughing in pure disbelief. $12 million, he whispered. $12 million for a useless patch of dirt filled with broken glass and overgrown weeds. I cannot believe the old fool was sitting on a gold mine this entire time and never even knew it. The sheer scale of the revelation hit me like a physical blow to the jaw. $12 million. They were not just trying to steal my house or my monthly retirement checks. They were trying to hijack my grandfather's sacred legacy, the ultimate payout that would set them up for a lifetime of extravagant, effortless wealth. But the land was solely in my name. The deed was locked safely away in my deposit box at the bank downtown. I had never added Brenda to that specific asset because it was my family heritage. In order to sell it to the developers, they needed my signature. And they knew a proud, stubborn man like me would never simply hand over his grandfather's land so Chloe could buy designer handbags and sports cars. I watched the screen as Brenda picked up the blueprint, a twisted, sinister smile spreading across her face. "We have to move quickly," she said, her tone as casual as if she were discussing the weather. "The developers want to close the deal by the end of the month. If Roland is still legally competent, he will block the sale. He always said he wanted to leave that dirt to a community church or some nonsense." Trey walked over to the bar cart, pouring himself another massive glass of my vintage bourbon. He took a sip and grinned. "Do not worry about a thing, Mom. I already spoke to Marcus. He is bringing the notary over this Friday evening." Chloe giggled, clapping her hands together. "Is the notary reliable?" she asked. We cannot afford any slip-ups when dealing with a $12 million transaction. Trey scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. The guy is totally corrupt. I paid him 10 grand under the table to look the other way. By Friday, the medicine will have Roland completely spaced out. We will sit him down at this very table, guide his shaky, confused little hand across the signature line, and the notary will stamp the power of attorney. It gives me absolute total control over all his real estate assets and his medical decisions. The room grew deathly quiet on my screen. Brenda looked at her son with a sickening swell of maternal pride. And then what she asked softly. Then Trey replied, his voice completely devoid of any human empathy. We exercise the medical clause. We have the doctor sign off that his dementia makes him a danger to himself. We put him in a state-run psychiatric ward, the cheap one down in the valley where they lock the doors from the outside and the staff does not ask questions. Once he is institutionalized, I sign the deed over to the tech company. The $12 million gets wired to our offshore accounts, and Roland becomes a ward of the state until he forgets how to breathe. I sat in the darkness of the guest house entirely numb, a state-run psychiatric ward. They were planning to lock me in a sterile, padded room, heavily medicated with mind-altering drugs, stripped of my dignity, my freedom, and my hard-earned wealth, waiting to die among strangers. The boy I had taught to shave the boy whose scraped knees I had bandaged with my own hands was casually orchestrating my eternal imprisonment. He was going to sell my flesh and blood inheritance to the highest bidder while I rotted in a locked facility. But the nightmare had one final, agonizing layer left to unfold. Brenda walked over to the sofa, picking up her wine glass. She took a slow, elegant sip, her eyes gleaming with a vile, triumphant light. Well, she said, her voice dripping with venomous joy. Once the old man is safely locked away in the ward, I can finally start living my life. I have already talked to Devon. Chloe raised her eyebrows, a wicked grin spreading across her lips. Devon, she asked, are you really going to move him into the main house? Brenda laughed. It was a loud, echoing sound that made my stomach violently turn. Why not, she replied. Roland paid off the mortgage 5 years ago. It is a beautiful, spacious house. Devon has been waiting patiently in his cramped little apartment for 3 years. He is young, he is vibrant, and he actually knows how to treat a woman. He is tired of sneaking around. Once the power of attorney is signed and Roland is out of the picture, Devon is moving his things into the master bedroom. We are going to redecorate the entire second floor with the first cut of the payout. My wife. The woman I had vowed to protect and cherish in sickness and in health. She had been carrying on a 3-year affair with a younger man right under my nose. She was actively planning to move her secret lover into the very home I had built, into the very bed I had purchased, using the millions of dollars stolen from my grandfather's legacy to fund their romantic paradise. They were going to toast to their new fortune, throwing lavish parties in my living room, while I sat in a state facility heavily drugged, wearing a hospital gown, and completely abandoned by the world. I turned off the phone screen. The sudden darkness of the guest house felt incredibly vast. I sat perfectly still in my worn recliner. I did not shed another tear. The profound, suffocating grief that had been crushing my chest for the past hour simply vanished. It evaporated like water thrown onto a blistering hot iron stove. In its place, a freezing razor-sharp rage began to solidify in my veins. It was a type of anger I had never experienced in my 65 years of life on this earth. It was not the hot, explosive anger that makes a man yell, throw punches, or break furniture. It was a deep, silent, deeply calculated fury. The kind of absolute fury that fundamentally rewrites your DNA. They had drastically underestimated the man they were dealing with. They looked at me and saw a tired, retired bus driver. They saw an aging, compliant fool whose deep love made him blind to their greed. They thought my silence was weakness. They thought my patience was stupidity, but they had made one catastrophic, irreversible mistake. They had let me skip my morning coffee. They had allowed the chemical fog to clear from my brain. I was no longer a confused victim stumbling blindly through a medicated haze. I was a fully alert, dangerously motivated man who had just been handed the exact blueprint of their entire criminal conspiracy. I knew their timeline. I knew their methods. I knew the exact players involved in their disgusting game. I stood up from the recliner. My legs were steady. My hands were perfectly calm, devoid of any tremors. I walked to the window of the guest house and stared out at the warm, inviting lights of the main house where my enemies were currently celebrating their impending victory. Friday. I had exactly until Friday to turn their brilliant masterpiece into a devastating trap. I was going to let them bring their corrupt notary into my home. I was going to let them set the stage and pour the champagne. And then when they thought they had won it all, I was going to bring the entire sky crashing down on their heads. The morning sunlight creeping through the blinds of the guest house used to feel like a warm blessing to a man who had spent his entire life waking up in the pitch dark. But on this particular Wednesday, that light felt like a glaring spotlight on an active crime scene. I lay in bed perfectly still, listening to the distant muffled sounds coming from the main house. I knew exactly what was about to happen. The performance of a lifetime was set to commence, and I had to become the exact pathetic broken shell of a man my family desperately needed me to be. I heard the crunch of gravel outside my window. Brenda was making her daily trek across the yard, carrying that heavy ceramic mug in her hand. The smell of the dark roast coffee wafted through the door before she even turned the knob. It was a scent that used to mean comfort, a symbol of a wife caring for her aging husband. Now it was the undeniable scent of pure, unadulterated betrayal. When the door creaked open, I made sure my eyes were completely vacant. I let my jaw go slack, allowing my mouth to hang slightly open. I forced a hollow, empty stare looking right through her, as if my mind was drifting 1,000,000 miles away in a thick gray fog. She walked in wearing her soft pink robe and her perfectly styled hair, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She smiled at me, a sweet, maternal smile that perfectly hid the venom flowing through her veins. "Good morning, sweetheart," she murmured, her voice smooth and gentle, an absolute flawless disguise for the poison she was carrying. I reached out with hands I intentionally forced to tremble. I grasped the mug, letting the ceramic edge rattle against my teeth, and took a fake, shallow sip. I clamped my throat shut, making absolutely sure not a single drop went down. As soon as she turned around to open the blinds, pretending to let the morning light in for her poor sick husband, I brought my hand to my mouth and coughed violently. I spat the bitter, chalky liquid directly into a small steel thermos I had tucked beneath the heavy wool blanket on my lap. I repeated this exact routine every single morning. I became a master of deception in my own home. When I walked across the room, I deliberately dragged my left foot across the floorboards, creating a pathetic, uneven shuffle. When I spoke to them, I slurred my words, turning my deep baritone voice into a weak, pathetic mumble. I would sit in my recliner and stare at a blank television screen for hours. Watching them fall for the act was both deeply satisfying and incredibly sickening. It was a profound humiliation to diminish myself, to suppress the strength and pride of an African-American man who had weathered decades of hard labor and racial prejudice to build a kingdom for his bloodline. But the sacrifice was absolutely necessary. My performance fueled their arrogance to terrifying heights. Because they thought my brain was rotting, they became incredibly sloppy. Trey would stand right in the middle of my living room, adjusting his expensive silk ties, openly discussing the luxury imported cars he planned to buy with my grandfather, commercial lot money. Chloe would spray her overpriced perfume and complain loudly about the smell of old age in the house, completely oblivious to the fact that I was absorbing every single cruel word with total crystal clear comprehension. Brenda would play the tragic martyr when the neighbors called, putting her hand on her chest and sighing about the heavy burden of caring for a husband who was losing his mind. She would text her secret younger lover right in front of my face, smiling at her phone, confident that my destroyed brain could not process a single thing happening around me. They thought they were leading a blind lamb to the slaughter. They had no idea they were walking straight into the jaws of a lion. Thursday morning finally brought the opening I desperately needed. I sat slumped in my chair while Brenda draped a fleece blanket over my knees. She patted my head like an obedient dog and announced that she and Chloe were driving to a high-end retail plaza in Buckhead for a full day of luxury shopping. They were using the credit cards they had stolen from my wallet to fund their spree. Trey had already left for his corporate office. I waited until I heard the heavy rumble of their luxury sport utility vehicle pulling out of the driveway. As soon as the sound faded down the street, the drooling, confused old man vanished completely. I stood up straight. My spine popped and the blood pumped fiercely through my veins. I moved with urgent, calculated precision. I grabbed my old leather briefcase and carefully packed the hidden thermos containing the poisoned coffee along with the crumpled pharmacy receipt I had dug out of the trash. I retrieved an emergency stash of cash from a hollowed-out space behind the guest house baseboard. I opened an application on my phone and ordered a private ride service. When the driver pulled up to the curb, I slipped out through the back gate, locking it securely behind me. The drive into downtown Atlanta was a blur of towering skyscrapers and bustling avenues. I looked out the window of the car, watching the city breathe and shift. I used to drive my 40-foot transit bus down these exact streets, navigating the chaotic traffic with absolute authority. I knew every intersection, every stoplight, and every neighborhood in this sprawling metropolis. For months, my family had made me feel like a helpless prisoner in my own backyard, entirely cut off from the world. But out here, surrounded by the concrete and steel of the city I helped build, I felt my dormant power surging back into my chest. I thought about my grandfather, a man who worked the brutal southern soil and saved his pennies to buy that commercial lot. He endured endless disrespect so his descendants could have a solid foundation. I was stepping onto my battlefield to protect that sacred legacy. I was going to reclaim my life and my dignity. My first destination was a prestigious, high-tier medical center connected to the local university. I deliberately avoided the family clinic where Brenda took me, knowing she might have spies or connections there. I paid entirely out of pocket to secure an immediate appointment with one of the top neurologists in the entire state of Georgia. Sitting in that sterile, brightly lit examination room, I dropped the act completely. When the specialist walked in, I looked him square in the eye, sitting tall and speaking with absolute, unwavering authority. I handed him the steel thermos and the crumpled pharmacy receipt. I explained the situation with cold clarity. I told him my wife and stepson were dosing me with an industrial-grade psychiatric sedative to manufacture a fake dementia diagnosis. I told him their ultimate goal was to steal a piece of commercial real estate worth $12 million and lock me in a state-run psychiatric ward to die. The doctor looked absolutely stunned. He stared at me, then at the thermos, but my steady, intense gaze told him I was deadly serious. He immediately ordered a full battery of comprehensive cognitive tests. I spent 3 grueling hours completing complex memory evaluations, spatial reasoning exams, and extensive psychological assessments. The medical staff asked me to recreate intricate geometric shapes from memory, to recall long lists of unrelated words, and to solve layered logic puzzles. I answered every single question with the sharp, rapid-fire accuracy of a man who had successfully memorized countless transit routes, schedules, and city grids for over 3 decades. I drew perfect clock faces. I repeated long strings of random numbers backward. I solved the puzzles without breaking a single sweat. When the exhaustive testing was finally complete, the neurologist returned to the room with a stack of paperwork. He handed me a certified ironclad medical document, adorned with official hospital seals and authorized signatures. It explicitly stated that Roland Jefferson possessed a completely healthy, perfectly functioning brain with absolutely zero signs of cognitive decline, dementia, or memory impairment. I was legally and medically proven to be 100% mentally competent. But I could not stop there. I demanded a comprehensive toxicology screening. I needed physical, irrefutable proof of the poison they were pushing into my veins. The nurses drew several vials of my blood, and the doctor sent the dark liquid from my thermos straight to the emergency laboratory for immediate analysis. The preliminary results confirmed my darkest, most horrifying fears. My bloodstream still contained dangerous, lingering levels of the heavy tranquilizer. The laboratory report on the coffee from the thermos was even more damning. The dark roast liquid was laced with enough crushed antipsychotic pills to render a healthy grown man completely incapacitated. I carefully placed the certified medical competency reports and the devastating toxicology results into my leather briefcase. I now possessed the impenetrable medical armor required to completely obliterate their fabricated narrative. My next destination was a towering glass-fronted office building situated right in the center of the financial district. I had spent the previous night researching the most ruthless, aggressive estate and civil litigation attorney in the entire city. I needed a man known for tearing fraudulent claims to shreds in a courtroom. I walked into a sprawling corner office and sat across the massive mahogany desk of a sharp, distinguished legal eagle who commanded respect the very second he spoke. I opened my briefcase and laid my entire arsenal out on his desk. I showed the attorney the certified medical documents proving my complete sanity. I handed over the toxicology report, detailing the exact chemical nature of the poison. Then I pulled out my phone and played the hidden camera footage. I let the lawyer watch Brenda, Trey, and Chloe drinking my vintage bourbon, casually laughing as they discussed the timeline for my institutionalization. The video clearly captured them, plotting the forged power of attorney, detailing the $12 million land sale to the tech conglomerate, and mocking my deteriorating state. I let the audio play clearly as Brenda happily discussed her plans to move her secret younger lover into my master bedroom once I was locked away in a psychiatric ward. The attorney leaned back in his high leather chair, steepling his fingers together. He was a man who had seen decades of family greed and corporate deception, but the sheer brazen evil of my situation left a cold, hard look in his eyes. He did not waste a single second. He immediately summoned his legal team into the office, and they went to work like a well-oiled machine. We drafted up ironclad legal barriers. We filed emergency confidential injunctions to freeze every single financial asset attached to my name, locking Brenda and Trey out completely without alerting them. We executed a fast-tracked transfer, moving the deed of my grandfather, commercial lot, out of my personal name and into an impenetrable, irrevocable trust that absolutely no power of attorney could ever touch or alter. To add a final layer of absolute destruction, the attorney brought in a highly connected private investigator. He was a tough, silent professional who took one look at the evidence and immediately set out to dig up every single piece of dirt available. His instructions were simple. Find everything on Brenda's secret lover. Dig into Trey mounting suffocating credit card debts and locate the corrupt notary they planned to use on Friday evening to facilitate the forged signature. I wanted every single exit firmly bolted shut before I dropped the match. By the time I walked out of that high-rise building and stepped back onto the busy sunlit sidewalks of Atlanta, the afternoon was giving way to the early evening. I took a deep breath of the city air. I was no longer a helpless victim waiting for the darkness to consume my mind. I was a fully armed, legally protected, medically certified force of nature. I had turned my profound despair into a masterclass of retaliation. I hailed a ride back to the quiet, affluent suburbs, mentally preparing to slip back into my character. I was going to shuffle back into that guest house, slump into my worn recliner, and put on the greatest performance of my life. I was going to let them think they were leading a blind lamb to the slaughter, completely unaware that they were stepping directly into a trap built of solid steel and absolute justice. There is a profound and heavy weight that settles deep into your bones when you finally realize you are holding the very sword that will sever your own family ties. Sitting in that sprawling glass-fronted office high above the busy streets of downtown Atlanta, I felt that weight pressing down on my shoulders. But it was no longer a burden of grief. It was the solid, unyielding weight of absolute justice. I sat across the massive mahogany desk from Harrison Caldwell, one of the most ruthless and brilliant estate attorneys in the entire state of Georgia. He was a man who commanded the room the second he opened his mouth, and he had assembled a team of financial experts and legal sharks who were currently moving like a well-oiled machine on my behalf. I unclasped the brass buckles of my old leather briefcase and reached inside. My hands completely steady and stripped of the fake tremors I had been practicing for months, pulled out a thick, yellowed envelope. I placed it gently on the polished wood of Harrison's desk. Inside that envelope was the original handwritten property deed to the 5-acre commercial lot on the outskirts of the city. I stared at the faded ink for a long moment. That piece of paper was not just a legal document. It was the physical manifestation of my bloodline. My grandfather Elijah Jefferson had been a sharecropper in rural Georgia. He had moved to Atlanta in the 1940s with nothing but the clothes on his back and a fierce, burning determination to build something permanent. He faced closed doors, racial prejudice, and backbreaking labor, working 3 grueling jobs just to save his pennies in a tin coffee can hidden under his mattress. He bought that forgotten, overgrown patch of dirt because it was the only piece of the world they would allow him to own. For decades, real estate developers and wealthy brokers told me to sell it for scraps. They called it worthless dirt. But I held on to it, paying the taxes every single year because to me its worth was entirely spiritual. It was a monument to an honest African-American man who refused to be broken by an unfair world. And now my own wife and stepson were plotting to steal that sacred inheritance to sell my grandfather's legacy to a massive tech conglomerate for $12 million, all so they could buy luxury cars and designer clothes, while I rotted away in a state-run psychiatric ward. The sheer unfathomable disrespect of it made my blood run boiling hot. Harrison Caldwell leaned forward, his sharp eyes scanning the old deed. "We are going to lock this down so tight that not even a wrecking ball could break into it," he said, his voice dropping into a serious, commanding tone. "Roland, we are executing an irrevocable trust right here, right now." He slid a towering stack of legal documents across the desk toward me. He explained the mechanics of the trap we were building. An irrevocable trust is exactly what it sounds like. It is a financial and legal vault cast in solid titanium. Once that property deed was transferred into the trust, I surrendered my direct individual ownership, placing the asset entirely under the control of a legally bound trustee system that I had appointed. That meant the $12 million lot was no longer mine to sell, give away, or sign over. More importantly, it meant that absolutely no power of attorney, no matter how officially it was stamped by a corrupt notary, could ever touch a single blade of grass on that property. Even if Trey somehow managed to guide my hand to sign his fraudulent papers, the signature would be completely legally void. He would be trying to steal a ghost. I picked up the heavy gold-plated pen Harrison offered me. I spent the next hour signing my name over and over again. With every stroke of the pen, I felt a massive, suffocating chain snapping off my chest. I was securing my grandfather's legacy. I was ensuring that the $12 million would never fund Brenda's secret affairs or Trey mounting credit card debts. The property was safe, but we could not stop there. We had to secure the cash. I pulled out the account numbers for my primary pension fund and my life savings. Decades of early morning transit shifts, driving 40-foot buses through the freezing rain and blistering southern heat, were sitting in those accounts. I watched as Harrison, financial expert, tapped rapidly on his keyboard, executing a total, uncompromising freeze on all my real assets. We locked down the retirement funds. We blocked the credit lines. We secured the investment portfolios. However, a smart hunter knows that you cannot spook the prey before they step into the cage. If Brenda went to the grocery store and her stolen credit card was suddenly declined, she would immediately panic. She would know I was onto them, and they might accelerate their violent plans to institutionalize me before I was ready. So the financial team set up a brilliant decoy. They created a dummy checking account, linking it directly to the cards Brenda and Trey currently possessed. We transferred exactly $400 into that dummy account. It was just enough money to buy their expensive lattes and fancy lunches for the next 24 hours, keeping them completely blind and comfortable in their arrogance. To them, the money was still flowing perfectly. They had no idea they were drinking from a well that had already run completely dry. By the time the legal and financial mobilization was complete, the late afternoon sun was beginning to dip below the towering skyline of downtown Atlanta. I shook Harrison's hand, feeling a profound, undeniable sense of power and liberation. I walked out of the towering glass building and stood on the busy sidewalk, taking a deep breath of the city air. I hailed a private ride service to take me back to the quiet, affluent suburbs. I sat in the back of the car, watching the familiar streets roll by, mentally preparing myself for the most grueling, emotionally taxing acting performance of my entire life. I had the legal armor. I had the medical documents proving my complete sanity. I had the toxicology reports documenting the poison they had been feeding me. The shield was fully forged. Now it was time to bait the hook. The private car dropped me off 2 blocks away from my property. I did not want them to see me arriving in a paid vehicle. I waited until the car turned the corner and disappeared before I began my physical transformation. I forced my broad, proud shoulders to slump forward, curving my spine into the posture of a defeated, broken old man. I let my jaw go slack. I dulled the sharp, intelligent light in my eyes, replacing it with a hollow, terrified vacancy. I began to drag my left foot across the pavement, creating that slow, uneven, pathetic shuffle that Brenda loved to mock behind my back. By the time I reached the edge of my driveway, Roland Jefferson, the survivor, was gone. Roland, the helpless victim, had returned to the stage. I noticed that the luxury sport utility vehicle was parked in the driveway. Brenda and Chloe had returned from their shopping spree. Trey's car was also parked near the garage. The entire audience was present. I bypassed the guest house entirely and shuffled directly toward the back door of the main house. I needed to make a grand entrance. I needed to put on a show so convincing, so heartbreakingly pathetic, that their greed would completely override whatever small amount of caution they had left. I pushed the back door open, my hands intentionally trembling as they gripped the handle. The kitchen was bright and smelled of expensive roasted garlic and herbs. Brenda was standing by the marble island, sipping a glass of chilled white wine, wearing a brand new designer blouse she had undoubtedly purchased with my stolen money. Trey was sitting at the dining table, typing furiously on his laptop, probably researching the offshore accounts he planned to use for his $12 million payout. Chloe was leaning against the counter, inspecting her freshly manicured nails. I took 3 slow, dragging steps into the kitchen, letting out a weak, confused groan. I reached out toward the counter, my hand shaking violently, and intentionally knocked a crystal water glass onto the floor. The glass hit the hardwood with a loud, sharp crash, shattering into dozens of glittering pieces. The 3 of them jumped, turning to stare at me. I did not wait for them to scold me. I immediately dropped to my knees, right there on the floor, surrounded by the broken glass. I buried my face in my trembling hands and began to weep, and the tears I cried were absolutely real. I did not have to fake the moisture streaming down my cheeks. I simply pulled from the deep, agonizing well of grief that came from knowing my 30-year marriage was a murderous lie. I cried for the boy I had raised, who now viewed me as a disposable piece of trash. I let the raw, authentic pain fuel my performance. Brenda. I sobbed, my voice cracking and slurring perfectly. Brenda, please help me. I am so scared. Brenda immediately set her wine glass down and rushed over to me. She kneeled on the floor, her face twisting into a mask of sweet, agonizing concern. The transition was so flawless, it was genuinely terrifying to witness. "Oh, my sweet Roland," she cooed, wrapping her arms around my shaking shoulders. "What is wrong, honey? Did you have an accident? Why are you out of the guest house?" I gripped the sleeves of her designer blouse, looking up at her with wide, terrified eyes. My mind. "Brenda," I gasped, forcing a pathetic stutter into my words. "The fog. It is so thick today. I cannot remember how I got to the kitchen. I cannot remember what year it is. It is slipping away, Brenda. I am losing my mind. I am losing everything." Trey slowly closed his laptop, standing up from the dining table. I could see the reflection of pure, unfiltered greed flashing in his eyes. He walked over, standing above me, looking down at the broken old man weeping on the floor. I leaned my head against Brenda, shoulder sobbing loudly into the fabric of her shirt. "I do not want to be a burden anymore," I cried out, making sure my voice echoed through the pristine kitchen. "I am terrified I am going to make a mistake. I am terrified I am going to forget to pay the bills or lose the house or lose the land my grandfather left me." "The commercial lot, Brenda. I cannot remember where the deed is. My brain is rotting away." The moment I mentioned the commercial lot, the air in the kitchen completely changed. The energy shifted from annoyance to electric buzzing anticipation. I could literally feel Brenda's heart beat a little faster against my chest. She stroked my hair, exchanging a rapid, wide-eyed look with Trey over my shoulder. I could not see her face, but I knew exactly what that look meant. They thought the poison was finally reaching its ultimate peak. They thought they had finally broken my brain into a million compliant pieces. "You need to take over," I begged, my voice dropping into a pathetic, desperate whisper. "Please, Brenda. Please, Trey. You have to take control of the estate. You have to take control of the money and the properties before I forget how to sign my own name. I want you to have the power. I trust you. I just want to rest. I just want the fear to stop. Please take the burden away from me." I hung my head, letting out long, shuddering breaths, playing the role of a man completely surrendering his autonomy. The silence that followed was thick and heavy. Then Brenda spoke. Her voice was incredibly soft, dripping with a venomous, triumphant sweetness that made my skin crawl. "Oh, my poor, brave husband," she whispered, kissing the top of my head. You do not need to worry about a single thing anymore. We are your family. We are going to protect you. We will take that heavy burden right off your shoulders." I kept my face buried in my hands, crying softly, but beneath my palms a cold, hard smile was fighting to break through. The bait was dangling right in front of their faces, shimmering and beautiful, and they were swallowing it whole. Brenda gently helped me up from the floor, brushing the dust off my knees. Trey stepped in right on cue, grabbing my arm with a firm, commanding grip. "Let us get you back to the guest house," Pops Trey said, his voice laced with a newfound arrogant authority. "You just need to lie down and rest your head. We will handle all the boring paperwork. You just focus on relaxing." They walked me slowly across the backyard, guiding me like a fragile piece of porcelain. They opened the door to the guest house and laid me down on the mattress. Brenda pulled the heavy wool blanket all the way up to my chin, tucking the edges in tightly. She smiled down at me, a smile so full of sinister victory, it was almost blinding. "Sleep now, sweetheart," she whispered. "Everything is going to be taken care of very soon." She turned off the bedside lamp and walked out of the room. But she did not close the door completely. She left it cracked just an inch, completely underestimating my hearing. I lay perfectly still in the dark, my breathing slow and even, listening intently to the muffled voices coming from the patio outside. "Did you see him?" Chloe hissed, her voice trembling with excitement. "He is completely far gone. He is practically begging us to take his money. The sedative is working better than the doctor ever promised." Trey let out a low, triumphant laugh. "I told you," he whispered fiercely. "The old man is toast. He is terrified of his own shadow. We cannot wait until Friday. If he is this far gone today, he might completely lose motor function by tomorrow. We need to strike while he can still physically hold a pen." I heard Brenda's sharp, decisive heels clicking on the concrete patio. "You are absolutely right, Trey," she said, her voice vibrating with greedy urgency. "Friday is too far away. Call Marcus right now. Tell him to get the notary over here tomorrow evening. Tell him I do not care what he has to cancel. I will double his bribe if I have to. We are doing this Thursday night. We are getting that power of attorney signed tomorrow, and then we are calling the medical transport to haul him away to the psychiatric ward first thing Friday morning." "Make the call," Chloe urged. "Let us finalize this $12 million payout so we can finally start living." I heard the heavy sliding glass door of the main house open and close as they hurried back inside to secure their corrupt notary. The backyard fell completely silent save for the gentle chirping of the evening crickets. I lay in the darkness of the guest house for a long time, staring up at the shadows dancing across the ceiling. I threw the heavy wool blanket off my chest and sat up on the edge of the mattress. My tears were gone. My fake tremors had vanished. My breathing was deep calm and incredibly steady. The ultimate trap was perfectly set. I had marched directly into the center of their greedy, murderous camp, fell to my knees, and handed them the exact rope they needed to hang themselves. They thought they were accelerating their master plan. They thought they had outsmarted a dying old man, bumping up the timeline to secure their millions, before my brain turned to complete mush. They were so blinded by the flashing neon signs of a $12 million corporate payout, so intoxicated by the thought of silencing me in a locked facility, that they could not see the massive steel jaws of the trap closing tightly around their ankles. Tomorrow night, Thursday evening, they were going to bring a corrupt legal official into my home. They were going to lay fraudulent documents on my dining table. They were going to smile and hand me a pen, expecting me to sign away my grandfather's legacy and my own freedom. I stood up from the bed and walked over to my leather briefcase resting quietly in the corner of the room. I ran my hand over the smooth, worn leather, feeling the solid, undeniable weight of the certified medical evaluations, the damning toxicology reports, and the irrevocable trust documents safely hidden inside. Everything I needed to utterly destroy their lives was locked in that case. Tomorrow night the performance would finally come to a brutal, glorious end. The curtain was going to drop on the pathetic, drooling old man, and Roland Jefferson, the furious, deeply wronged survivor, was going to step into the light. And when the dust finally settled, I was going to make absolutely sure that the only people being locked away behind cold, heavy doors would be the very monsters who tried to bury me. The thick, humid air of the Atlanta evening settled over my backyard like a heavy wool blanket. It was Thursday night, the eve of my supposed destruction. I sat alone in the dim quiet of the guest house, staring out the window at the sprawling brick home I had built from the ground up. The lights inside the main house were blazing bright, casting long golden beams across the freshly cut lawn. To anyone driving past our property, it probably looked like a picture of absolute suburban perfection. A successful African-American family enjoying a peaceful evening in their beautiful home. But I knew the horrifying truth. That house was no longer a home. It was a den of thieves, and the people inside were currently celebrating a murder that had not even happened yet. I leaned back in my worn recliner and picked up my cell phone from the side table. The battery was fully charged. The volume was turned all the way up. I tapped the icon for the hidden camera I had planted in their living room and watched as the live video feed flooded my screen with high-definition clarity. The audio hissed for a brief second, before picking up the crystal-clear sounds of clinking crystal and loud, arrogant laughter. They were throwing themselves a private victory party. Trey, Chloe, and Brenda were gathered around the massive kitchen island. They had ordered an extravagant spread of expensive seafood and steaks from the most exclusive restaurant downtown. The dining table was littered with empty silver platters, discarded oyster shells, and 3 open bottles of vintage champagne. I watched my stepson, a boy I had carried on my shoulders and taught how to tie his first necktie, pop the cork on a 4th bottle. The champagne bubbled over the rim, spilling onto the polished marble countertops. He did not bother to wipe it up. He just laughed, pouring the expensive, sparkling wine into 3 tall glasses. "Here is to Friday," Trey announced, raising his glass high into the air. His face was flushed with alcohol and unrestrained greed. "Here is to the corrupt notary, the beautiful state of Georgia, and the $12 million payout that is going to change our lives forever." Brenda and Chloe cheered loudly, tapping their glasses against his. The sharp, clear ring of the crystal echoed through the tiny speaker of my phone. I sat perfectly still in the dark, my breathing slow and measured, forcing myself to watch every single second of their treacherous celebration. I needed to see this. I needed to hear every word. I needed to carve their true faces into my memory so that tomorrow, when I brought the hammer of justice down upon their heads, I would not feel a single ounce of hesitation. Trey took a long gulp of champagne and leaned back against the kitchen counter. He shook his head, a look of profound disgust crossing his features. "You know what the craziest part of all this is?" he asked his mother and his wife. "The craziest part is that the old man actually spent 35 years of his life waking up at 4 in the morning to drive a public city bus. 35 years. Putting on that cheap, stiff uniform, sitting in traffic, dealing with absolute garbage on the streets, all to bring home a pathetic middle-class paycheck. And the entire time he was sitting on a $12 million gold mine and was too stupid to even realize it. He laughed again, a cruel barking sound. He broke his back for decades because he thought there was dignity in hard labor. What a complete joke. He could have sold that overgrown dirt lot 20 years ago, and we could have been living like royalty. But no, he wanted to hold on to his precious grandfather legacy. Well, tomorrow night, his legacy is buying me a brand new imported sports car and a vacation home in the Bahamas. Hearing him mock my life work felt like a physical blow to my chest. He was insulting 35 years of honest, brutal labor. He was mocking the very sweat that paid for the expensive private university degree hanging on his office wall. He was laughing at the transit uniform I wore with pride, the uniform that put the food in his stomach and the clothes on his back, when his biological father walked out on him and Brenda left them with absolutely nothing. I had worked double shifts through freezing rain and blistering southern heat to make sure Trey never had to struggle the way my grandfather did. And this was his gratitude. He viewed my sacrifice not as an act of profound fatherly love, but as an act of pathetic stupidity. Chloe nodded in fierce agreement, swirling the champagne in her glass. Her blonde hair fell over her shoulders as she scrunched up her nose in pure disgust. I do not care about his stupid transit job or his ridiculous family history, she said, her voice dripping with venom. I am just thrilled that we never have to look at him or smell him ever again. Brenda chuckled softly, leaning in closer to her daughter-in-law. What do you mean, Chloe? You know exactly what I mean, Brenda, Chloe whined, waving her manicured hand in the air. That old man smell. That awful mixture of medicinal muscle rub, stale coffee, and sickness that follows him everywhere he goes. It makes me absolutely nauseous. Every time he shuffles into the room with that blank, drooling look on his face, I literally have to hold my breath. I am telling you, Trey, the very second the medical transport takes him away to the psychiatric ward tomorrow morning, I am calling a professional fumigation company. I want this entire property scrubbed clean. I want the guest house completely bulldozed. I want a luxury infinity pool put right where that shack is currently standing. I want every single trace of Roland Jefferson entirely erased from our lives. I tightened my grip on my cell phone until my knuckles turned completely white in the dark. Chloe was a woman I had welcomed into my home with open arms. When she and Trey got married, I paid for the entire wedding reception. I bought her a beautiful diamond necklace to welcome her into our family. I treated her like a daughter. And she was standing in my kitchen drinking champagne bought with my money, complaining about the smell of my aging body, and planning the demolition of my sanctuary. The sheer breathtaking vanity of her words was almost impossible to process. She was willing to discard a human life just to improve the aesthetic of her backyard. But the final, most devastating blow was yet to come. Brenda walked around the kitchen island, pouring herself another massive glass of champagne. She looked at her son and her daughter-in-law with a deeply satisfied, arrogant smirk. You two need to give me a little bit more credit, Brenda boasted, her voice vibrating with dark, malicious pride. Do you have any idea how exhausting it has been for me to play the role of the devoted, loving wife all these years? Do you know how hard it was to smile and kiss his cheek every single morning while slipping those heavy sedatives into his coffee? Trey raised his glass to his mother. You are a mastermind, Mom. I will give you that. Brenda took a slow, elegant sip of her drink. It was almost too easy, she continued, leaning against the marble counter. Roland is a relic. He is a dinosaur from a forgotten era. He actually believes in all that nonsense about honor and duty and traditional marriage vows. He believes that because he provided for us, we owed him our absolute loyalty. He was so completely blinded by his old-fashioned principles that he never once questioned why his memory was failing. He never once questioned why his limbs were getting heavy. He just looked at me with those pathetic, trusting eyes and swallowed whatever poison I handed him. She let out a long, theatrical sigh, shaking her head. He is a simple, predictable man, she said coldly. He just wanted to be loved and respected. And I used that desperate need against him every single day. I isolated him from his friends. I made him doubt his own reality. I broke his mind piece by piece, and he actually thanked me for taking such good care of him. Tomorrow night, when we slide that power of attorney across this table, he will sign away his grandfather's $12 million legacy because he genuinely believes we are trying to protect him. It is almost poetic. Brenda paused, looking around the expansive, beautifully decorated kitchen. And the best part is, she whispered, her eyes flashing with a sickening, triumphant light. By Saturday morning, I will be sipping coffee in the master bedroom, with Devon and Roland will be strapped to a hospital bed in a state facility, wondering why his loving family never came back to visit him. The live video feed continued to play on my phone, showing them laughing, drinking, and toasting to their incredible victory. But I could no longer hear the sound of their voices. A profound, overwhelming silence had fallen over my mind. I sat in the darkness of the guest house, breathing in the cool air. For months I had been carrying a heavy bleeding wound in the center of my chest. Despite uncovering their plot, despite securing the legal armor to destroy them, there had still been a tiny microscopic fragment of sorrow lingering in my soul. A small, pathetic part of me had still mourned the death of my 30-year marriage. A small part of me still grieved for the loss of the boy I had raised as my own son. Because no matter how betrayed you feel, severing the ties of family is an act of unnatural violence. But as I listened to Brenda mock my devotion, as I listened to her brag about exploiting my love, and as I watched Trey and Chloe laugh at my lifelong sacrifice, that final lingering fragment of sorrow completely incinerated, the grief did not just disappear, it caught fire. It burned bright and violent until every single memory of joy, every family vacation, every birthday celebration, and every tender moment we had ever shared was reduced to a pile of worthless gray ash. My love for them was officially irrevocably dead. I turned off the cell phone screen. The room plunged back into complete darkness. I did not feel sad. I did not feel broken. I felt a terrifying absolute clarity. My grandfather had endured the blistering heat of the southern sun and the cruel mockery of an unfair world to buy that land. He did it so that one day a man of his own blood could stand tall and independent. He did not bleed into that soil so a venomous woman and a spoiled, greedy child could steal it away to buy sports cars and fund secret affairs. I stood up from my recliner. My body felt incredibly light. The lingering aches and pains of the past few months had entirely vanished, replaced by a surge of pure, freezing adrenaline. I walked over to the small wooden desk in the corner of the room where my leather briefcase was resting. I snapped the brass buckles open and looked inside. The certified medical documents proving my complete, undeniable sanity were neatly stacked. The toxicology reports detailing the exact chemical breakdown of their poison were securely filed. The legal injunctions freezing every single one of my financial assets were perfectly in place, and the documentation of the irrevocable trust proving that my grandfather's $12 million commercial lot was now completely untouchable by any fraudulent power of attorney sat right on top. My arsenal was fully loaded. The weapons of their destruction were sharpened and ready to be deployed. I walked over to the guest house window and looked out at the main house one last time. The kitchen lights were still blazing. I could see their silhouettes moving around the island, pouring the last drops of champagne, completely intoxicated by their own perceived brilliance. They thought tomorrow night was the grand finale of their masterpiece. They thought tomorrow night was the moment they finally secured their millions and erased Roland Jefferson from the face of the earth. They were expecting a broken, drooling, confused old man to shuffle into their dining room, weeping and begging for their help. They were expecting a victim who would eagerly hand over his signature just to feel a shred of their fake comfort. I smiled. It was a cold, hard, merciless smile that stretched tight across my face in the dark. "Enjoy the champagne," I whispered to the shadows, my voice low and steady. "Enjoy the taste of my vintage bourbon. Enjoy the warmth of my house and the comfort of my furniture. Laugh as loud as you can tonight, because tomorrow the sun is going to rise on a very different world. Tomorrow the play acting comes to an end. Tomorrow you are going to look into the eyes of the man you tried to murder, and you are going to realize that you have completely destroyed your own lives. I closed the blinds, shutting out the golden light from the main house. I walked over to my bed, lay down on the mattress, and closed my eyes. For the first time in 6 excruciating months, my mind was entirely at peace. The storm was coming, and I was absolutely flawlessly ready to bring the thunder. The Friday evening sky over Atlanta was bleeding into deep shades of bruised purple and dark crimson. I stood in the absolute silence of the guest house, staring out the small window at the sprawling lawn I had meticulously maintained for years. My grandfather used to tell me that a man's true measure is determined by the storms he is willing to walk through. I was about to walk directly into a Category 5 hurricane, but my soul felt remarkably still. The freezing, razor-sharp anger that had ignited in my chest the night before had solidified into a heavy, impenetrable block of ice. I had spent the entire day mentally fortifying my mind, building a massive emotional wall between myself and the people in the main house. The certified medical documents proving my complete sanity and the legal trust papers locking away my commercial lot were safely secured in my leather briefcase hidden beneath my mattress. Tonight was not about the law. Tonight was about the performance of a lifetime. At exactly 7 o'clock, a dark, unwashed sedan pulled into my pristine driveway. It was not a luxury vehicle like the ones Trey and Chloe proudly drove. It was a nondescript, faded car, the kind driven by a man who prefers to slip in and out of places completely unnoticed. A short, balding man stepped out, carrying a worn leather satchel under his arm. He wore a cheap gray suit that looked a full size too big, and he kept nervously wiping his sweating forehead with a handkerchief. He glanced over his shoulder repeatedly as he walked up the brick pathway. This was him. The corrupt notary public. The man Trey had bribed with $10,000 in cash to illegally validate the theft of my $12 million legacy. I watched through the blinds as Trey jogged out the back door to greet the man. Trey clapped the notary on the shoulder, laughing entirely too loudly. His greedy, anxious energy was completely spilling over into the quiet evening air. They walked inside the main house together, and the heavy wooden back door clicked shut. The stage was finally set. The actors were in their designated places. It was time for the pathetic, broken fool to make his grand entrance. I took one final deep breath, letting the cold clarity settle deep into my bones. Then I dropped my broad shoulders. I let my spine curve forward, imitating the defeated, sunken posture of an elderly man whose mind was rapidly crumbling into dust. I made my eyes go wide and vacant, stripping away decades of hard-earned wisdom and replacing it with terrified confusion. I began to drag my left foot across the floorboards, practicing the uneven, pathetic shuffle that Brenda loved to mock behind my back. I walked out of the guest house and made my way across the stone patio. Every single step felt like lifting 100 pounds of solid rock, but I kept my rhythm agonizingly slow. I had to look like a man who was barely holding on to his own physical reality. When I pushed the back door open, the air inside the kitchen was thick and heavy with anticipation. The smell of an expensive, catered seafood dinner lingered in the room, but nobody was eating. They were all gathered tightly around my grand oak dining table. It was the very table I had saved up for months to buy when Brenda and I first got married, a piece of furniture meant for family holidays and shared blessings. Now that beautiful wood surface was covered in thick stacks of legal documents, crisp white pages that represented the total intended destruction of my life. Brenda was standing at the head of the table, wearing a pristine white blouse and her expensive pearl necklace, looking like the absolute picture of suburban grace and maternal care. Chloe was sitting to the side, tapping her freshly manicured nails impatiently against the wood. Trey was standing right next to the sweating notary, pointing at the signature lines with a heavy gold pen. When my shuffling feet crossed the threshold into the dining room, the conversation stopped dead. All four of them turned to look at me. I let my jaw hang slack, dropping my gaze directly to the floor. I let out a low, confused mumble, pretending to be entirely disoriented by the bright crystal lights hanging from the ceiling. Brenda immediately glided across the room toward me. She wrapped her arm around my waist, leading me toward the table with an exaggerated, sickeningly sweet gentleness. She smelled of expensive vanilla perfume, a scent that now made my stomach violently turn. "Here he is," Brenda cooed, her voice projected loud enough for the notary to clearly hear. "Come sit down, Roland, honey. You look so incredibly tired today. We are just going to take care of some boring paperwork so you can go back to sleep in your comfortable bed." I let her guide me into a heavy wooden chair at the head of the table. I stared blankly at the sprawling stacks of paper in front of me. The notary cleared his throat, shifting very uncomfortably in his cheap gray suit. He looked at my vacant expression, then looked nervously over at Trey. "Are we completely sure he understands what is happening here?" the notary asked, his voice squeaking slightly with fear. Trey had paid him a massive bribe to look the other way, but even this corrupt official seemed hesitant about the sheer blatant cruelty of the scene unfolding in front of him. He was looking at an African-American man who appeared entirely hollowed out, a man who clearly lacked the basic mental capacity to sign away a $12 million commercial lot. Trey stepped forward, his face hardening with aggressive impatience. He is just having a rough night, but he knows exactly what he is doing. Trey snapped, staring the notary down with a cold, challenging glare. "We went over this entire process yesterday. He wants me to manage his affairs because his memory is completely slipping away. Right, Pops?" Trey looked down at me, his eyes flashing with a silent, menacing threat. I kept my face perfectly blank. I let my head bob up and down in a slow, pathetic nod. I let a small trail of saliva gather at the corner of my mouth to really sell the absolute illusion of my mental decay. Brenda reached out and placed her warm, soft hand directly over my weathered knuckles. Her touch felt like a blistering hot iron resting against my skin, but I did not flinch. I did not pull away. I had to endure the physical contact to secure the trap. "Roland." "Sweetheart," Brenda whispered, leaning her face incredibly close to mine. "You remember we talked about this, right? Your mind is getting so cloudy lately. You keep forgetting important things. You keep getting confused wandering around the property. It is simply not safe for you to manage the properties and the bank accounts anymore. We just want to help you. We want to take this heavy, terrible burden right off your shoulders so you can just relax and be fully taken care of. All you have to do is sign your beautiful name right here on these little lines." She pointed to the thick stack of legal documents resting on the oak wood. "The fraudulent power of attorney. The real estate transfer forms for my grandfather commercial lot. The medical directives that would legally allow them to throw me into a locked state-run psychiatric ward by tomorrow morning. They had it all perfectly arranged. A complete ironclad legal package systematically designed to strip me of my generational wealth, my physical freedom, and my human dignity in one single evening." I looked at the documents with a vacant, glazed expression. Deep inside my chest, a massive inferno of rage was burning so intensely, I thought it might melt my ribs. This woman had shared my home for 30 years. I had worked exhausting double shifts driving a massive city bus through the freezing winter rain and the blistering southern heat just to pay off the mortgage on the roof over her head. I had taken her son and raised him as my own flesh and blood. I had paid for his university tuition. I had paid for his lavish wedding to Chloe. I had never once asked for a single ounce of gratitude or repayment. And here they were, surrounding me like starving wild vultures, waiting eagerly for me to sign away the legacy my grandfather bled into the Georgia soil to build. The sheer monstrous audacity of their premeditated plan was almost too enormous to fully comprehend. They were not just stealing my money. They were trying to completely erase my humanity so Brenda could move a younger man into my house. I let out a soft, confused whimper, shaking my head slowly from side to side. My hands. Brenda, I mumbled, slurring the words heavily, making them sound like a thick mess of syllables. My hands are too tired. I cannot read the letters on the paper. They are all too blurry. Chloe let out a loud, exasperated sigh, rolling her eyes dramatically toward the ceiling. "Oh, for heaven's sake," she muttered, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. "Can we just get this over with already? The smell of the medicine in here is giving me a massive migraine." Trey shot his wife a brief warning look, but his own patience was clearly wearing completely thin. The intoxicating illusion of the impending $12 million payout was making him reckless and aggressive. He walked around the table and stood directly behind my heavy wooden chair, looming over me like a dark, suffocating shadow. "Come on, Pops," Trey said, his voice losing every trace of fake sweetness and dropping into a harsh, demanding growl. "Stop playing these little games. We do not have all night to sit here. You need to sign these papers right now so the notary can leave." He grabbed the heavy gold pen from the center of the table. He reached right over my shoulder and forcefully shoved the pen directly into my right hand. His grip on my wrist was incredibly tight, his fingers digging bruising and painful into my aging skin. He physically pulled my arm forward, positioning my hand over the bottom of the first fraudulent document right above the dotted signature line. "Just sign it." "Roland," Brenda urged, her voice taking on a sharp, frantic edge of greed. "Do it for us. Do it for your family so we can protect you." The notary reached into his worn leather satchel and pulled out a heavy metal stamp. The official state seal of validation. He was sweating profusely, wiping his brow again. He did not even wait for me to actually sign the paper. He pressed the heavy stamp into a black ink pad and slammed it down onto the bottom of the page right next to where my hand was hovering. The loud rhythmic thud of the stamp hitting the solid oak table echoed violently through the quiet room. Thud, thud, thud. He was validating the fraudulent documents, prematurely driven purely by the promise of his $10,000 bribe and his desperate, sweating desire to flee the scene of the crime. The tension in the dining room became incredibly thick. It felt like the oxygen had been sucked completely out of the space, leaving nothing but static electricity. Brenda was holding her breath, her eyes glued intensely to the tip of the gold pen resting in my hand. Chloe had stopped tapping her manicured nails, leaning forward over the table with a hungry, predatory gleam shining in her eyes. Trey was practically panting, his heavy, ragged breaths washing over the back of my neck, as he kept his hand firmly locked around my wrist, ready to physically force my hand across the paper if I hesitated for another second. If I signed that paper, they truly thought they had won the war. They thought they had successfully executed the absolute perfect crime against a helpless old man. They believed with every fiber of their corrupt souls that by tomorrow morning I would be heavily sedated in a sterile hospital gown, locked forever behind thick steel doors, while they popped vintage champagne and welcomed Brenda's secret lover into my master bedroom. I stared down at the dotted line. The black ink from the notary premature stamp was still wet, gleaming slightly under the bright light of the crystal chandelier above us. I felt the cold, smooth metal of the gold pen resting between my fingers. The grand oak table beneath my arms felt solid and real. I thought about my grandfather, Elijah Jefferson. I thought about the deep, permanent calluses on his working hands and the deep, weary lines carved into his face. I thought about how he endured a world that actively hated him just so he could leave a patch of overgrown commercial dirt to his bloodline. That land was not just a $12 million corporate payout. It was our history. It was our endurance. And these ungrateful parasites were trying to steal it to buy imported sports cars and fund their vile, pathetic secrets. I let the agonizing silence stretch out. I let the burning anticipation build in the room until it was practically screaming in their ears. I held the gold pen hovering exactly 1 inch above the crisp white paper. I let my hand shake violently, making the metal vibrate and catch the light. Trey squeezed my wrist even harder, his fingernails digging painfully deep into my skin. "Sign it, old man," Trey hissed directly into my ear, dropping the respectful act entirely. "Just sign the damn paper right now." Brenda leaned completely over the table, her eyes wide and frantic with desperation. "Do it, Roland," she commanded, her voice dropping into a vicious, breathless whisper. I kept the pen hovering right above the dotted line. The heavy, suffocating weight of their combined greed pressed down on me from all sides of the room. The corrupt, sweaty notary stood waiting, his hand resting nervously on his briefcase, ready to run. The fake, loving wife, the treacherous stepson, and the arrogant daughter-in-law all stood holding their breath, waiting eagerly for the final stroke of ink that would erase Roland Jefferson from the world forever. The absolute climax of their monstrous deception had finally arrived in my dining room, and I was holding the literal key to their total destruction right in the palm of my shaking hand. The heavy gold pen felt cold and foreign between my fingers. For a fraction of a second, the entire dining room seemed to hold its collective breath. I could hear the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, marking the final moments of my old life. Trey was squeezing my wrist so tightly, his fingernails were leaving deep, crescent-shaped indentations in my dark skin. His hot, rapid breath washed over the back of my neck, reeking of expensive champagne and unbridled greed. Across the solid oak table, Brenda was leaning forward so far, she was practically hovering over the fraudulent documents. Her eyes were completely dilated, fixed on the tip of my pen with a ravenous, consuming hunger. Chloe stood off to the side, gripping her crystal wine glass, her lips parted in a cruel, expectant smirk, and the corrupt notary was already packing his heavy metal stamp back into his worn leather satchel, shifting his weight nervously from foot to foot, eager to collect his blood money and run into the night. They were all waiting for me to surrender. They were waiting for Roland Jefferson to legally erase himself from the world. I did not sign the paper. Instead, I slowly relaxed my fingers. The heavy gold pen slipped from my grasp and clattered loudly against the polished wood of the dining table, rolling away until it bumped against the base of a silver candlestick. The sound was sharp and sudden, breaking the suffocating tension in the room like a gunshot. Trey let out a sharp, frustrated grunt, immediately reaching down to pick the pen back up. "Come on, old man," he growled, his voice dripping with venomous irritation. "Stop messing around. Pick it up and sign the paper. We do not have all night." But I did not reach for the pen. I took a deep, steadying breath, drawing the cool air down into the very bottom of my lungs. And then I began to change. I let the pathetic, artificial weakness completely drain out of my body. The slump in my shoulders, the curved spine of a defeated invalid simply vanished. I straightened my back, pulling myself up to my full 6'2" height. The sudden upward movement was so entirely unexpected that Trey literally stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of the dining chair in his shock. I rolled my neck, feeling the joints pop and settle into their proper alignment. I turned my head and looked directly across the table at the woman I had married 30 years ago. I stripped away the hollow, vacant stare I had been forcing for months. I let my true eyes shine through bright, sharp, and piercingly clear. I looked at Brenda with a freezing, terrifying clarity that stripped away every single lie hanging in the air between us. The color instantly drained from her perfectly powdered face, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She was staring at a man who was supposed to be completely sedated and cognitively destroyed, but instead she was looking at a fully lucid, deeply enraged patriarch. I rested my strong, steady hands flat on the oak table and leaned slightly forward. "I think my memory just came back," I said. My voice was no longer a weak, pathetic slur. It was a deep, resonant baritone rumbling through the room with the force of an incoming freight train. It was the voice of a man who commanded respect. The absolute silence that crashed down on the kitchen was deafening. Chloe dropped her crystal wine glass. It shattered against the hardwood floor, sending shards of glass and expensive champagne flying across the room, but nobody even blinked. Trey was standing frozen, staring at me with his mouth hanging open, his eyes darting frantically from my face to the unsigned documents on the table. The corrupt notary clutched his leather satchel tightly against his chest, taking 2 slow steps toward the back door, clearly realizing that he had just walked into a massive, catastrophic trap. Brenda let out a nervous, high-pitched giggle, trying desperately to salvage the collapsing illusion. "Roland, sweetheart," she stammered, her voice shaking so badly she could barely form the words. "What are you talking about, honey? You are confused. The sickness is just making you act strange. You need to sit down and rest." "I am not sick, Brenda," I replied, taking a slow, deliberate step around the edge of the dining table. "And I am definitely not confused. In fact, I have never seen you more clearly in my entire life." Before she could utter another pathetic lie, I reached into the pocket of my trousers and pulled out the small black remote control for the massive smart television mounted on the living room wall. I aimed it directly at the screen and pressed the center button. The television flared to life, illuminating the dark living room with a bright, blinding glow. I had spent the entire afternoon linking my cell phone directly to the television, casting the hidden camera footage I had recorded the night before so it would play on an endless, continuous loop. The volume was turned all the way up. Suddenly, the quiet dining room was filled with the loud, arrogant voices of my own family, echoing from the television speakers. On the massive flat screen, Brenda was standing by the bar cart, holding up the small amber vial of crushed pills. Her voice rang out crystal clear. "Keep crushing these into his food. The doctor said a few more weeks of this, and he won't even know his own name." Trey's face turned a sickening shade of ash gray. He stumbled backward, hitting the kitchen island, knocking over a silver platter of uneaten oysters. He stared at the television screen, watching himself laugh and joke about locking me in a state psychiatric ward and stealing my $12 million commercial lot. Chloe let out a loud, piercing shriek, covering her mouth with both hands, as her own voice echoed through the house, complaining about the smell of the old man and demanding that my guest house be bulldozed. Brenda looked like she was going to physically collapse. Her knees buckled slightly, and she had to grip the edge of the dining table just to remain standing. She looked from the television screen, playing her treacherous confession directly back to me. Her chest was heaving, her eyes wide with a wild, frantic panic. "Roland," she gasped, her voice completely devoid of the sweet maternal tone she had weaponized for months. "Roland, please, I can explain. It is not what it looks like. We were just joking. We were just trying to figure out the best medical care for you. Do not insult my intelligence, Brenda." I cut her off, my voice cracking like a whip across the room. "I know exactly what you were doing. I know all about the daily doses of antipsychotic sedatives you crushed into my morning coffee. I know all about the $12 million tech conglomerate buyout for my grandfather land. And I certainly know all about Devon, your young secret lover, who you planned to move into my master bedroom the very second you locked me away in a state facility to rot. The mention of her lover name was the final nail in the coffin. Brenda let out a choked, devastated sob, completely crumbling under the sheer weight of the absolute truth. Trey tried to recover his arrogant swagger, puffing out his chest and stepping toward me. "Now you listen to me, old man," Trey shouted, his voice cracking with desperate bravado. "You are legally incompetent. Nobody is going to believe a word you say. We have doctor notes. We have a legal notary right here. You are going to sign those papers, or I swear to God I will force your hand myself." He lunged toward the table, but I did not even flinch. I just stood there looking at him with pure, unadulterated pity. "You are too late, Trey," I said softly, tapping my fingers against the stack of fraudulent documents. "I took a little trip downtown yesterday afternoon while you were busy spending my stolen credit cards. I saw a top-tier neurologist. I have a certified ironclad medical document proving I am 100% mentally competent. I also have a full toxicology screening documenting the exact chemical makeup of the poison you have been feeding me. And as for my grandfather land, I already transferred the deed into an impenetrable, irrevocable trust. You cannot sell it. You cannot touch it. You have absolutely nothing." Trey's jaw dropped. The realization that his $12 million payday had vanished into thin air hit him like a physical blow. He staggered back, running his hands through his hair, completely unable to process his total defeat. The corrupt notary did not wait for another second. He spun around and made a mad, desperate dash for the back door, intending to flee into the night. But he never made it to the handle. Suddenly, the quiet suburban street outside exploded with sound. The deafening wail of multiple police sirens shattered the evening silence. Bright flashing red and blue lights illuminated the front windows, casting wild, spinning shadows across the living room walls. The heavy thumping sound of heavy boots charging up the front porch echoed through the house. The notary froze, his hand hovering over the doorknob. Brenda let out a terrifying, wailing scream, dropping to her knees on the hardwood floor. Chloe backed away into the corner of the kitchen, trembling uncontrollably, her luxury shopping bags completely forgotten. Trey looked around the room like a trapped rat, desperately searching for an exit that simply did not exist. Before anyone could move a muscle, the heavy oak front door of the main house was violently kicked open. The wood splintered and the door slammed loudly against the interior wall. Half a dozen uniformed local police officers poured into the living room, their hands resting firmly on their duty belts, moving with swift, tactical precision. Right behind them, a tall, broad-shouldered detective in a sharp gray suit stepped through the threshold. He had the calm, authoritative demeanor of a man who had seen exactly this type of familial evil countless times before. The detective walked straight into the dining room, taking in the scene. He looked at the massive television screen, still playing the hidden camera footage of Brenda holding the vial of crushed pills. He looked at the stack of fraudulent power of attorney documents sitting on the dining table. He looked at the sweating, terrified notary, the weeping wife, and the panicking stepson. And finally, he looked directly at me. "Mr. Roland Jefferson," the detective asked, his voice carrying a deep, respectful tone. I stood incredibly tall, smoothing out the front of my shirt. "Yes, detective," I replied. "I am Roland Jefferson." "We received the evidence packet from your attorney this afternoon," the detective said, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "We have reviewed the medical certifications, the toxicology reports, and the hidden camera footage. I must say, sir, it is one of the most comprehensive and disturbing cases of elder abuse and attempted fraud I have ever seen in my career." The detective turned his hard, uncompromising gaze toward my family. He gestured to the uniformed officers waiting in the living room. "Secure the perimeter," he ordered sharply. Nobody leaves this house. Brenda crawled forward on her knees, reaching out to grab the hem of my trousers. Roland, please, she begged, tears streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. Roland, you are my husband. We built this life together. You cannot do this to me. I love you. I was just scared. I did not know what I was doing. Please tell them to leave. I looked down at the woman I had cherished for 30 years. I remembered the long nights working overtime just to buy her a nice anniversary gift. I remembered building this very kitchen so she could have her dream home. And then I remembered the taste of the chemical poison she cheerfully handed me every single morning. I felt absolutely nothing for her. The well of my forgiveness had completely run dry. You stopped being my wife the moment you decided my life was worth less than a commercial land buyout, Brenda. I said, my voice ice cold and completely steady. You invited monsters into my home, and now you are going to pay the price. I looked up at the detective, meeting his serious gaze. I raised my hand and pointed a steady, unwavering finger directly at the 3 people cowering in my kitchen. Arrest them all, I commanded, my voice echoing with finality. Arrest them for conspiracy to commit fraud, for grand theft, and for attempted murder. The officers moved in instantly. 2 officers grabbed Trey, twisting his arms roughly behind his back, as he cursed and kicked, completely losing his corporate arrogance. Another officer cornered Chloe, snapping the heavy steel cuffs around her manicured wrists, while she sobbed hysterically about her reputation. The detective himself pulled Brenda off the floor, reading her the Miranda rights in a sharp, monotonous voice as she wept uncontrollably, begging for mercy that was never going to come. Even the corrupt notary was thrown against the wall, his worn leather satchel confiscated as evidence. I stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the flashing blue and red lights, watching the people who had tried to bury me being dragged out the front door in chains. The air in the house suddenly felt incredibly clean. The heavy, suffocating weight of their greed was finally gone. I had walked through the fire, and I had emerged completely victorious. The storm had finally passed, and Roland Jefferson was still standing. The gavel came down in the courtroom with a sound like a gunshot echoing through the chamber. It was the absolute finality of justice. Standing there in my best suit, I felt the immense weight of the past 6 months finally slide from my shoulders. The corrupt notary, whose hands had trembled as he tried to validate their stolen future, had folded under the slightest pressure from the district attorney. He gave them everything. He turned on Trey and Brenda faster than a snake in the grass to secure his own deal. Every detail of their grand conspiracy was laid bare before the judge. The toxicology reports confirming the sedatives in my system were irrefutable. The hidden camera footage showing them laughing while they poisoned my coffee was played for the entire court to see. It was a humiliating spectacle for them. Trey and Chloe sat in their expensive designer suits, their faces drained of color and arrogance, while the prosecutor methodically dismantled their lives. They were found guilty on multiple counts of federal fraud and conspiracy. The judge sentenced them both to long terms in federal prison. I watched them being led away in heavy steel chains, their eyes darting around in frantic disbelief. They still could not understand how the old bus driver had outmaneuvered them so completely. Brenda stood for her own sentencing, looking like a ghost of the woman I had once cherished. She was convicted of felony poisoning and systemic elder abuse. Her dissent was absolute. The moment she was taken into custody, her secret lover disappeared into the wind without leaving a trace. He was a parasite, and when the host was no longer useful, he simply detached. He did not call, he did not wait, he did not care. She was left entirely alone to face the consequences of her monstrous choices. Seeing her in that drab prison uniform, stripped of all her stolen finery, I felt no lingering spark of my old love. That woman had been a ghost haunting my life for years, and now she was gone forever. The court proceedings were a brutal and necessary cleansing. Every piece of property they had attempted to seize was reclaimed. Every cent they had pilfered from my savings was tracked and seized for restitution. With the legal battle behind me, the real work of erasing the poison from my life began. The tech conglomerate finalized the purchase of my grandfather land by the end of that same month. The final check for $14 million was deposited into my account. It was a staggering amount of wealth, far beyond anything a man of my background ever expected to touch. Yet the money was not the true victory. The real triumph was the freedom to walk away. I hired a specialized crew to enter that brick house one final time. I told them to clear out every single piece of furniture Brenda had bought with her stolen spoils. I wanted it all gone. I watched as they hauled the designer rugs, the pretentious abstract art, and the expensive bar cart to the curb. It was like watching a fever dream finally break. I sold the Atlanta house within weeks. I did not want the walls to hold the memory of their laughter or their secret meetings. I walked out of that front door one last time and handed the keys to the new owner without a single glance back. I took that $14 million and I turned it into a future that honored the man who started it all. I established a massive scholarship fund in my grandfather's name dedicated to young African American engineering students who needed a helping hand to get through university. I purchased a small, beautiful home near the coast where the air was always clear and the ocean breeze kept my mind sharp. I have no more fake coffee. I have no more acting. I have no more fear. I spend my days walking on the sand and listening to the waves. I am a free man. I am a man of integrity, and I am finally at peace. Life is a long and winding road, with many storms along the way. But the truth is the only compass that will never fail you. If you have ever been through a situation where the people you trusted most turned out to be your greatest enemies, please tell me about it in the comments. I read every word. If this story meant something to you, do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe to this channel for more life stories. Let me know what city you are watching from and what time of day it is for you. It brings me a lot of joy to know who is listening and where you are in the world. Until next time, stay strong and guard your heart. The crisp morning air rolling off the water is a sensation I will never take for granted again. Today, the sun is rising over a magnificent mirror glass lake nestled deep in the rugged mountains of Montana. The sky is painting itself in brilliant sweeping strokes of gold and burnt orange reflecting perfectly off the tranquil surface of the water. I step out of the door of my 40-foot luxury recreational vehicle, letting my heavy boots hit the damp, fragrant earth. The sharp, clean scent of pine needles and fresh mountain air fills my lungs, instantly clearing out any lingering ghosts of the toxic past. In my right hand, I am holding a steaming ceramic mug of dark roast coffee. It is a rich, robust blend that I ground myself just 10 minutes ago in my spacious, pristine kitchen. I take a long, deep sip, letting the warm liquid slide down my throat. There is no bitter, chalky aftertaste. There is no chemical residue burning my tongue or clouding my thoughts. There is only the pure, unadulterated taste of absolute freedom. I am 66 years old today. A little over a year ago, my own flesh and blood had me completely convinced that my mind was turning into useless mush. They had me shuffling across a hardwood floor, dragging my feet, believing I was standing on the terrifying, absolute precipice of a locked psychiatric ward. But this morning my hands are perfectly steady. My spine is straight and strong. The suffocating leaden fatigue that used to chain me to that worn-out recliner in the guest house is a distant, fading memory. My health has been completely, fully, and miraculously restored. I breathe in the cold mountain air and feel a massive surge of vibrant life pumping fiercely through my veins. The man they tried to bury is not just surviving. He is thriving in ways they could never even begin to comprehend. I walked down to the rocky edge of the lake, carrying my favorite graphite fishing rod and a small organized tackle box. Fishing has become my daily ritual, my quiet meditation, and my ultimate sanctuary. For 35 years, I gripped the massive, heavy steering wheel of an Atlanta transit bus, navigating endless rivers of gray concrete and oceans of blaring, aggressive traffic. I spent my days surrounded by the relentless, deafening noise of the city, grinding my bones down to dust, just to provide a comfortable, luxurious suburban paradise for people who secretly despised me. Out here on the open, winding road, the only sounds are the gentle, rhythmic lapping of the water against the shore and the distant, haunting call of a lone, bald eagle. Out here, there are no strict transit schedules to meet. There are no ungrateful stepchildren expecting a massive financial handout. There are no treacherous wives hiding lethal poison behind a sweet, painted smile. I cast my line far out into the deep blue water, watching the silver lure break the surface with a satisfying splash. I settle into my canvas folding chair and let my mind wander across the vast expanse of the last 12 months. Healing is a strange and highly unpredictable journey. When you have the very foundation of your reality violently ripped out from beneath you, the rebuilding process takes immense time and profound, agonizing patience. There were nights in the very beginning when I would wake up in a freezing cold sweat in the master bedroom of my new motor coach, fully expecting to see Brenda standing in the dark doorway with that sinister little amber vial of crushed pills. There were moments when the sheer staggering magnitude of their betrayal would hit me so incredibly hard, I had to pull my massive rig over to the side of the highway just to grip the steering wheel and catch my ragged breath. The hardest pill to swallow was not the realization that they desperately wanted my money. Greed is a common, thoroughly predictable human flaw. The most agonizing truth was accepting how easily absolute evil can hide behind the familiar, smiling faces of the people you love the most. Brenda slept next to me for 3 solid decades. She knew my deepest fears, my quiet dreams, and the immense pride I took in being a reliable, steadfast provider for our household. Trey looked up to me when he was a scared, fatherless boy. I taught him how to throw a baseball in the backyard. I taught him how to tie a Windsor knot for his high school prom. I invested my own blood and sweat into molding him into a successful man. And yet they looked at me and saw absolutely nothing but a walking bank account, an annoying inconvenience standing squarely between them and a $12 million corporate payout. They maliciously weaponized my trust. They used my deep, unconditional fatherly love as a heavy blindfold so they could systematically dismantle my humanity piece by piece. But as I sit here watching the morning mist slowly evaporate off the surface of the mountain lake, I realize that their ultimate fatal failure was fundamentally misunderstanding the true nature of my resilience. They severely mistook my quiet, compliant demeanor for weakness. They thought that because I was a working-class African-American man approaching his twilight years, I would simply bow my head and fade away without putting up a fight. They thought my love made me a gullible, easy target. But the undeniable truth is a man who spends his entire life building a strong, protective fortress for his family knows exactly how to tear that fortress down to the ground when the walls become hopelessly corrupt. The sheer strength it takes to sacrifice your own desires for 35 years is the exact same strength it takes to stand up in a formal dining room, look your executioners dead in the eye, and watch them burn to ash in the fire of their own making. Truth and resilience will always invariably win the long game. The elaborate lies they spun, the fake medical narratives they tried to expertly construct, the corrupt officials they tried to bribe with envelopes of cash. None of it could withstand the relentless, unyielding, blazing light of absolute truth. Today, Brenda, Trey, and Chloe are sitting in small, cramped concrete cells, completely stripped of their designer clothes, their imported luxury cars, and their arrogant, toxic pride. Their entire world consists of rigidly scheduled meals and heavy locked doors, while my world is as expansive and limitless as the American highway system. I reel in my line, feeling a sudden familiar heavy tug. A beautiful silver-scaled mountain trout breaches the surface, thrashing wildly against the hook, sending droplets of water flying into the morning sunlight. I carefully, expertly reel it in, detach the small hook, and gently release the magnificent fish back into the crystal-clear water. I do not need to keep it. The thrill is entirely in the catch, in the quiet, solitary triumph of the moment. I wipe my hands on a clean towel and look back up the hill at my luxury recreational vehicle. It is a magnificent, beautiful machine, a rolling mobile palace equipped with a full modern kitchen, a king-sized bed, and massive panoramic windows that let me view the entire country on my own specific terms. My grandfather, Elijah Jefferson, bought an overgrown, weed-infested patch of industrial dirt in a forgotten, neglected part of Atlanta, so that his bloodline could finally have a piece of this country to call their own. He endured the brutal heat and the stinging insults of a deeply unfair society. He could never have possibly imagined that his hard-earned, stubborn legacy would eventually fund a $14 million ticket to absolute, boundless freedom for his grandson. I carry his proud, resilient spirit with me across every state line, every steep mountain pass, and every sun-baked desert highway. I have driven my rig through the towering, majestic red rock canyons of Utah. I have parked and watched the blazing neon sunset over the vast, empty deserts of Arizona. I have camped along the crashing rocky coastline of the Pacific Northwest, listening to the ocean roar against the steep cliffs under a blanket of stars. I am traveling this beautiful, sprawling, magnificent country, completely untethered and entirely unbound. I meet good, honest working people in crowded RV parks and small-town roadside diners, people who look you directly in the eye and mean exactly what they say without hidden agendas. I have slowly learned to trust again, but my trust is no longer given freely or blindly. It is strictly earned through mutual respect and genuine proven character. I have built a new, authentic, extended family out here on the road, a vast community of fellow travelers and quiet survivors who understand perfectly that the greatest, most valuable wealth a man can ever possess is the absolute peace in his own mind. I finish my coffee, the last dark drop, tasting just as rich and perfect as the very first. The sun is fully, completely over the mountains, now burning away the very last of the crisp morning chill. I pack up my tackle box and fold my canvas chair, feeling a deep, profound tidal wave of gratitude wash completely over my soul. I survived the darkest, most terrifying valley a man could ever be maliciously pushed into. I walked straight through the valley of the shadow of death, and I did not just survive, I emerged with a shining crown of absolute total victory. I reclaimed my health, my mind, my fortune, and my future. I left the toxic ruins of my past completely behind me, selling the brick house and washing my hands of the people who tried to bury me alive. My brothers and sisters, never mistake a man's kindness and sacrifice for weakness. Trust your gut. If something feels wrong in your own home, it probably is. Protect your peace, protect your mind, and protect what you worked your whole life to build. If this story moved you or gave you strength, please hit that like button to bring a smile to this old transit driver face. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss my next true life stories. And tell me in the comments, what city or state are you watching this video from? And what time is it there right now? It brings me so much joy to know where my extended family is tuning in from. Stay vigilant, stay blessed, and I will see you in the next story.